Hey guys, imagine this. You're lying on a creaky wooden table in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and something suspiciously like mold. A man in a blood-stained apron, who looks like he moonlights as a butcher, is waving a rusty saw over your leg, muttering about balancing your humors. No anesthesia, no sanitation, just a bottle of questionable whiskey and a prayer you don't die of. Sepsis before dinner. Welcome to Victorian medicine, where the cure was often worse than the disease, and sometimes it was the disease. Buckle up, because we're about to plunge into a world where doctors were basically playing Russian roulette with your life, and the odds weren't in your favor. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture London, 1830s, a city drowning in smog, sewage, and self-confidence. The Industrial Revolution is churning out factories, filth, and a new breed of medical experts who think they've cracked the code to human survival. Spoiler alert, they haven't. Medicine in the Victorian era was a wild cocktail of arrogance, ignorance, and a dash of blind optimism. If you got sick, your best bet was to stay home, pray, and hope your body figured it out, because the moment you stepped into a doctor's office, you were rolling the dice with death. Let's start with the doctors themselves, shall we? These weren't the kindly, stethoscope-wearing professionals you're used to. Oh no, the Victorian doctors were often glorified hobbyists with a medical degree that might as well have been printed on a napkin. Training? Spotty at best. You could become a doctor by attending a few lectures, dissecting a corpse or two if you were lucky, and paying a hefty fee to some dodgy medical school. No standardized exams, no peer reviews, just vibes. And those vibes, they were confident. These guys strutted around in top hats, wielding lancets like they were conducting a symphony, ready to cure you with methods that sound like they were ripped from a horror novel. The cornerstone of their medical genius was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This wasn't new, it was a recycled idea from ancient Greece, but the Victorians clung to it like a lifeboat in a storm. The logic went like this: if you're sick, your humors are out of whack. Too much blood, feverish, melancholic? Don't worry, they'd balance you out. How? By draining your blood, purging your guts, or making you sweat until you were more raisin than human. It was like trying to fix a broken clock by smashing it with a hammer. Bloodletting was the rock star of Victorian treatments. Feeling a bit under the weather, headache, stubbed your toe, time to bleed. Doctors would slice open a vein with a lancet, a fancy word for a glorified pocket knife. Or, if they were feeling fancy, they'd use leeches. Yes, leeches. Those slimy little vampires were the height of medical sophistication. A doctor might slap a dozen leeches on your arm, let them suck out a pint or two of blood, and call it a day. Never mind that losing blood weakens you, or that the open wounds could get infected in a world where washing hands was considered optional. Leeches were so popular that they were harvested to near extinction in Europe, and doctors had to import them from far-flung corners of the world. Imagine that. A global leech trade, all to suck the life out of you in the name of health, but bloodletting was just the warm-up act. If you survived the leech party, you might be subjected to purging. This wasn't a gentle detox cleanse with green smoothies. No, purging meant forcing you to vomit, or, more likely, endure explosive diarrhea until you were begging for mercy. Doctors used emetics like ipecac or purgatives like calomel, a mercury-based compound that was about as safe as juggling lit torches. Calomel didn't just flush your system, it could rot your teeth, loosen your gums, and poison you slowly. Side effects included tremors, mood swings, and, oh yeah, potential death. But hey, at least your humors were balanced. The logic was that if you were sick, something bad was inside you, and the fastest way to get it out was through every available exit. It's like they thought your body was a haunted house, and the ghosts could be evicted by turning you into a human fire hose. Hospitals, don't get your hopes up. If you were poor, you ended up in a charity hospital, which was less a place of healing and more a warehouse for the dying. Overcrowded, understaffed, and reeking of despair, these places were where hope went to die. Beds were shared, sometimes with corpses. Surgical tools were reused without cleaning. passing infections like gossip at a tea party. The air was thick with the smell of pus, blood, and despair, and the floors were often slick with who knows what. If you were lucky enough to afford a private doctor, you might get treated at home, but that didn't mean you were safe. Home visits often meant the same barbaric treatments, just with better wallpaper. Surgery was a special kind of nightmare. Imagine you're on that creaky table staring at a surgeon who's had maybe 3 hours of sleep and a shot of brandy for breakfast. Anesthesia wasn't a thing until the late 1840s, and even then, it was a gamble. Before that, if you needed surgery, say to remove a tumor or a gangrenous limb, you got a swig of alcohol, a leather strap to bite down on, and a room full of spectators. Yes, spectators. Surgical theaters were literal theaters, where medical students and curious onlookers paid to watch you get carved up like a Christmas roast. Speed was the surgeon's best friend, not precision. A good surgeon could amputate a leg in under a minute, but good didn't mean clean. Saws were dull, knives were dirty, and infections were so common they had a name: hospital fever. Gangrene, sepsis, and tetanus were the uninvited guests at every operation, and the survival rate was about as cheerful as a rainy Monday. Let's talk about the drugs. Victorian pharmacies were like witches' cauldrons, stocked with potions that ranged from useless to downright deadly. Opium was a fan favorite, prescribed for everything from a cough to a bad mood. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, was handed out like candy. Got a fussy baby? Laudanum. Can't sleep? Laudanum. Feeling a bit sad? Laudanum. It was addictive, of course, but addiction wasn't a concept back then, just weakness of character. Mercury was another go-to, used in ointments, pills, and even injections. It was supposed to cure syphilis, but more often it caused madness, organ failure, and a slow, miserable death. Arsenic was also popular, believe it or not, prescribed for skin conditions and even as a tonic to invigorate you. Yes, the same poison used to kill rats was also a health supplement. Victorian medicine was basically a game of how much poison can we give before it's too much. Spoiler, they often miscalculated. Women had it especially rough. If you were a woman in Victorian England, medicine wasn't just dangerous, it was downright misogynistic. Got a headache? You're hysterical. Feeling anxious? Hysterical. Have an opinion? Definitely hysterical. The cure? A trip to the asylum, or if you were lucky, just a good old-fashioned clitoridectomy. Yes, you heard that right. Some doctors thought removing parts of a woman's anatomy would cure her nervous disorders. It's the kind of logic that makes you wonder if these guys were trying to win an award for most creative ways to ruin a life. Pregnancy and childbirth were a death sentence for many. Puerperal fever, caused by doctors not washing their hands between deliveries, killed countless women. Ignaz Semmelweis, the guy who suggested hand washing might help, was laughed out of the room and driven to an asylum. That's right, the man who could have saved thousands was dismissed as a lunatic, while doctors kept spreading infections like they were handing out party favors. The irony is thicker than the smog over London. Let's not forget the quacks. Victorian England was crawling with snake oil salesmen peddling miracle cures. Want to grow hair, cure tuberculosis, live forever? There was a tonic for that. These potions were often just alcohol, sugar, and a pinch of hope, but people bought them by the gallon. Patent medicines were advertised everywhere. Newspapers, posters, even on the sides of buildings. Doctor, Feel-Good's vital elixir promised to cure everything from gout to a broken heart, but all it really did was lighten your wallet and maybe give you a buzz. The government didn't regulate this stuff, so you could sell swamp water labeled as elixir of immortality, and no one would bat an eye until the funerals started piling up. Disease was everywhere, and the Victorians had no idea how it spread. Germ theory wasn't widely accepted until the 1860s, so for most of the era, doctors blamed miasma, bad air, for everything from cholera to plague. Cities were open sewers, with rivers of human waste flowing through the streets. The Great Stink of 1858 was so bad, it forced Parliament to adjourn because the smell was unbearable. Yet doctors kept insisting it was the air, not the water, making people sick. Cholera outbreaks were rampant, killing thousands, and the cure? More purging, more bleeding, and maybe a dash of laudanum to make you forget you're dying. Public health was a joke. Sanitation was non-existent, and clean water was a luxury. People drank from the same rivers they dumped their waste into, then wondered why everyone was dropping dead. The average lifespan was around 40, and that's if you made it past childhood. Infant mortality was so high that parents often didn't name their kids until they were sure they'd survive. It was a grim lottery, and the odds were stacked against you. By now, you're probably thinking, how did anyone survive this medical madness? Honestly, sheer luck. Your body's natural defenses had to be Olympic level to outlast the cures. If you made it through a doctor's visit without losing a limb, your sanity, or your life, you deserved a medal. But the Victorians weren't all doom and gloom. They were also wildly optimistic, convinced they were on the cusp of medical greatness. Every new gadget, every new theory was hailed as the key to immortality. Take the stethoscope, introduced in 1816, but not widely used until later. It was a game changer, letting doctors listen to your heart without pressing their ear to your chest. But even that was controversial. Some doctors thought it was too invasive, like eavesdropping on your organs. The Victorian era was a paradox, a time of incredible progress and jaw-dropping stupidity. For every step forward, like the discovery of anesthesia or the beginnings of germ theory, there were 10 steps back into the land of leeches, mercury, and blind faith. So, as we wrap up this first dive into the nightmare of Victorian medicine, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Next time you're at the doctor, getting a clean needle and a prescription that won't kill you, say a quiet thank you to the poor souls who survived the 19th century's medical gauntlet. We've got 3 more parts to go, and trust me, the absurdity only gets wilder from here. Stay tuned for more tales of survival, stupidity, and the occasional stroke of genius that somehow kept humanity limping along. Alright, let's dive back into the grim, grimy world of Victorian medicine, where every doctor's visit was a gamble and the house always won. Picture yourself in a foggy, gaslit alley in 1840s London, clutching your side, hoping that nagging pain isn't about to land you in the hands of a surgeon who thinks sterile is just a fancy word for slightly less dirty. We're picking up where we left off, diving deeper into the absurd, painful, and occasionally hilarious ways Victorian medicine tried, and often failed, to keep people alive. Buckle up, because this second part is going to get even wilder, with quack cures, bizarre gadgets, and a medical mindset that makes you wonder how humanity survived it all. Let's start with the obsession with vitality. Victorians were absolutely fixated on the idea that you could invigorate your body, like it was a wind-up toy running low on juice. Feeling tired, weak, a bit sad? Don't worry, there was a cure for that, usually involving electricity, because nothing says health like a good zap. Electrotherapy was the hot new trend, and not the kind you get at a modern physical therapist's office. We're talking about machines that looked like they were stolen from Frankenstein's lab, with wires, cranks, and a salesman promising to restore your vital force. Doctors, or more often shady entrepreneurs, would hook you up to a battery-powered contraption and send jolts through your body. The idea was to stimulate your nerves, muscles, or whatever else they thought was slacking. Did it work? About as well as it trying to charge your phone with a lightning bolt. Side effects included burns, seizures, and the distinct feeling you'd been scammed. But that didn't stop people from lining up for a shock. These devices were everywhere. Portable electric belts, galvanic baths, even electrified corsets for the ladies, because apparently nothing says feminine vitality like a mild electrocution while you're trying to breathe. And if electricity wasn't your thing, don't worry. There were plenty of other ways to invigorate yourself straight to the grave. Take hydropathy, the so-called water cure. This wasn't just drinking more water or taking a nice bath. Oh no, this was extreme. Hydropathic clinics would wrap you in cold, wet sheets for hours, dunk you in freezing baths, or blast you with high-pressure hoses until you were begging for mercy. The theory was that water could flush out disease, stimulate circulation, or just generally bully your body into behaving. People flocked to these spa-like torture chambers, convinced they'd emerge as the picture of health. Instead, many caught pneumonia or just drowned in the absurdity of it all. The water cure was so popular that even Queen Victoria's doctors dabbled in it, which tells you everything you need to know about the era's medical judgment. But let's not forget the diet fads, because Victorians loved a good health trend as much as any modern influencer. One popular regimen was the Grahamite diet, pushed by Sylvester Graham, a man who thought bland food was the key to moral and physical purity. His followers swore by whole grain bread, hence the graham cracker, and avoided meat, spices, or anything remotely enjoyable. The idea was that a boring diet would calm your passions and keep you healthy. Spoiler, it didn't. Malnutrition was a real risk, and let's be honest, nobody's surviving cholera on a diet of crackers and willpower. Then there was the opposite extreme, the Fletcherizing craze, where you chewed each bite of food 100 times to extract maximum vitality. Imagine sitting at dinner, chewing your boiled cabbage for 5 minutes straight, while your family wonders if you've lost your mind. It was less about health and more about turning mealtime into an endurance sport. Let's talk about the kids, because Victorian medicine had a special kind of cruelty reserved for the little ones. Children were seen as miniature adults, so they got the same brutal treatments as grown-ups. Bleeding, purging, the works. Got a teething toddler? No problem. Just lance their gums with a sharp blade to relieve pressure. Screaming baby? Dose them with laudanum, or one of the many soothing syrups loaded with opium or alcohol. These were marketed as miracle cures for fussy kids, but they often left babies addicted or, worse, dead. Infant mortality was already sky high. About 1 in 5 kids didn't make it to their 5th birthday. But these cures didn't help. Parents, desperate for relief, trusted the fancy bottles and glowing advertisements, not knowing they were poisoning their own children. It's heartbreaking, but also a grim reminder that Victorian medicine didn't discriminate. It was an equal opportunity disaster. Now, let's venture into the world of mental health, where things get even darker. If you thought physical ailments were mishandled, mental illness was a whole other level of horror. The Victorian era loved labeling people, especially women, as insane, for anything from depression to reading too many novels. Asylums were the go-to solution, and they were less about treatment and more about warehousing anyone society didn't know what to do with. Picture this. You're a woman who's a bit too outspoken, or maybe you're grieving a loss. Next thing you know, you're locked in a damp, overcrowded asylum, strapped to a chair, or worse, subjected to moral treatment. This sounded nice, calm environments, routine, fresh air, but in practice it often meant isolation, restraint, and a complete loss of autonomy. Some asylums used spinning chairs to realign your brain, or dunked patients in ice-cold baths to shock them back to sanity. Others experimented with early forms of lobotomy or trepanning, drilling holes in your skull to let out the bad spirits. If you were lucky, you got out alive. If not, you became a statistic in the asylum's ledger, forgotten by the world. Men weren't immune either. Shell-shocked soldiers, alcoholics, or anyone deemed eccentric could find themselves locked away, often for life. The stigma of mental illness was so intense that families would rather abandon their loved ones than admit they needed help. And the doctors, they were just as clueless as anyone else, armed with theories about weak nerves or hereditary madness, but no real solutions. The rise of mesmerism, hypnosis's creepy cousin, didn't help. Doctors and quacks alike claimed they could cure insanity by waving their hands over you or staring into your soul. It was nonsense, but desperate people ate it up because what else could they do? Speaking of quacks, the patent medicine industry was booming, and it was a circus of scams. These weren't just tonics anymore. They were full-on lifestyle brands. Take Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed as a cure for every female ailment under the sun. It was mostly alcohol with a sprinkle of herbs, but the ads promised it would fix everything from menstrual cramps to nervous prostration. Women drank it by the bottle, not realizing they were just getting tipsy. Or, how about Dr. William's pink pills for pale people? The name alone is a marketing masterpiece, promising to cure anemia, weakness, and probably your existential dread. These pills were mostly sugar, but they flew off the shelves because Victorians were suckers for a good slogan. The lack of regulation meant anyone could slap a label on a bottle and call it medicine. Some of these concoctions contained cocaine, morphine, or even strychnine. Yes, rat poison, because apparently a little danger was part of the charm. Surgery's still a nightmare, but by the 1840s, things were starting to shift, slightly. Ether and chloroform hit the scene, promising to knock you out so you wouldn't feel the saw hacking through your bones. Sounds great, right? Not so fast. Anesthesia was a new toy, and doctors didn't exactly have the manual. Overdose was common, and some patients never woke up. Plus, it didn't solve the infection problem. Surgeons still operated in their street clothes, often with blood and pus caked on from the last patient. The laudable pus theory was still kicking around, where doctors thought pus in a wound was a sign of healing. Spoiler, it wasn't. It was a sign you were about to lose a limb or your life to sepsis. The operating table was less a place of healing and more a gladiatorial arena where you fought for survival against both the disease and the doctor. And let's not ignore the dental situation, because Victorian teeth were a horror show. Tooth decay was rampant thanks to sugar-heavy diets and zero understanding of oral hygiene. Toothbrushes existed, but they were a luxury, and toothpaste was often just chalk or charcoal. If you had a toothache, your options were grim. A barber surgeon might yank it out with pliers, no anesthesia, or you could try a tooth powder laced with mercury or arsenic. Some people resorted to DIY fixes, like tying a string to their tooth and a doorknob, then slamming the door. Dentistry wasn't a proper profession yet, so anyone with a strong grip and a pair of tongs could call themselves a dentist. The result? Mangled mouths, infections, and a lot of people who just gave up and lived with the pain. Public health was still a disaster, but there were glimmers of hope. John Snow, the father of epidemiology, figured out in 1854 that cholera was spread through contaminated water, not bad air. Did anyone listen? Not really. He had to physically remove the handle from a water pump in Soho to stop an outbreak, because apparently that's what it took to get people's attention. Meanwhile, the streets were still open sewers, and the Thames was basically a liquid landfill. The Great Stink of 1858 forced some changes, like the construction of proper sewers, but progress was slow, and people kept dying in droves. The Victorians were starting to wake up to the idea that maybe, just maybe, filth and disease were connected, but it was a hard sell when doctors were still prescribing mercury for a cough. The era's optimism kept things moving, though. Every new invention was hailed as the future of medicine. Take the vapor cure, where you inhaled steam infused with herbs or chemicals to cleanse your lungs. Sounds relaxing until you realize those chemicals were often toxic and the steam could scald your airways. Or how about the magnetic tractor, a metal rod waved over your body to pull out disease? It was pure pseudoscience, but it had a cult following because Victorians loved anything that sounded futuristic. The line between science and quackery was razor thin, and most people couldn't tell the difference. As we close out this second chapter of our Victorian medical nightmare, let's pause to marvel at the sheer audacity of it all. These people were so desperate to live that they'd try anything: electric shocks, freezing baths, even chewing their food into oblivion. They didn't know any better, but they believed they were on the cutting edge. Next time, we'll dig into the weirdest medical gadgets, the rise of heroic doctors who actually started to figure things out, and the patients who somehow survived it all. Stay tuned, because the roller coaster of Victorian medicine is only getting crazier. Here we go, plunging back into the feverish, leech-filled swamp of Victorian medicine, where every treatment was a roll of the dice and the prize was usually just more suffering. Imagine you're in 1850s London, coughing your lungs out in a smog-choked tenement, praying your doctor doesn't show up with a bag of rusty tools and a gleam in his eye. We're now in part 3 of our saga, and things are about to get weirder, wilder, and somehow even more absurd. From bizarre medical gadgets that belong in a steampunk nightmare to the first glimmers of actual science. This is the era where hope and horror collided like a runaway horse cart. Let's dive into the madness. First up, the Victorian love affair with gadgets. These folks were obsessed with gizmos, convinced that the right contraption could fix anything from a broken leg to a broken spirit. Enter the electromagnetic belt, a wearable device that promised to cure everything from impotence to indigestion by zapping you with low-grade electricity. Picture a leather strap studded with wires and batteries wrapped around your waist like a torture device from a sci-fi novel. Did it work? About as well as yelling at your illness to go away. But the ads were irresistible, with bold claims and drawings of strapping men glowing with vital energy. People shelled out fortunes for these belts, only to end up with burns, shocks, and a lighter wallet. Then there was the vibratory chair, a contraption that shook you like a rag doll to stimulate circulation. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair that jiggles violently while a doctor nods approvingly, muttering about realigning your vital forces. It was less a medical treatment and more a carnival ride gone wrong. And don't forget the pulmonary inhaler, a device that forced you to breathe in vapors of everything from camphor to carbolic acid. The idea was to cleanse your lungs, but in practice it often left you gasping for air or coughing up blood. These gadgets were the love children of optimism and ignorance, and the Victorians couldn't get enough of them. But gadgets weren't the only game in town. Let's talk about the rise of heroic doctors, men who, against all odds, started to push back against the medical lunacy. Take James Simpson, the Scottish doctor who championed chloroform as an anesthetic in the 1840s. Before this, surgery was a screaming, sweating ordeal. But Simpson saw patients knocked out with ether and thought, we can do better. Chloroform was a game changer, letting surgeons work without the patient thrashing like a fish on a hook. But here's the catch. Nobody knew how much was too much. Doctors would douse a cloth in chloroform, hold it over your face, and hope you woke up. Sometimes you didn't. Simpson himself faced backlash from religious types who argued that pain was God's will, especially for women in childbirth. Yes, some doctors thought knocking out a laboring mother was defying divine punishment. Simpson, to his credit, told them to stuff it and kept pushing for anesthesia, saving countless lives and eardrums. Then there's Joseph Lister, the guy who finally said, hey, maybe we should stop killing our patients with dirty hands. In the 1860s, Lister read about Louis Pasteur's germ theory and had a light bulb moment. He started using carbolic acid to sterilize surgical tools and wounds, slashing infection rates. Sounds obvious now, but back then it was revolutionary and controversial. Surgeons scoffed at the idea of invisible germs causing trouble. They were proud of their blood-stained coats, wearing them like badges of honor. Lister's insistence on cleanliness was met with eye rolls and accusations of being overly fussy. But the numbers didn't lie. His patients survived at rates that made other surgeons look like butchers. Still, it took decades for antiseptic techniques to catch on, because changing a Victorian doctor's mind was like trying to teach a cat to fetch. While heroes like Simpson and Lister were dragging medicine into the modern age, the quacks were still running wild. One of the wildest was the homeopathy craze, pioneered by Samuel Hahnemann. Homeopathy was based on the idea that like cures like, so a substance that causes symptoms in a healthy person could cure those same symptoms in a sick person if diluted to the point of being basically water. We're talking dilution so extreme that you'd be lucky to find a single molecule of the original substance in your dose. Homeopaths claim this made the medicine stronger, which is the kind of logic that makes you wonder if they were drinking their own potions. Yet homeopathy was a hit, especially among the upper classes who loved anything that sounded sophisticated and didn't involve leeches. The kicker? Homeopathy often worked better than traditional medicine, not because it was effective, but because it didn't actively harm you. Doing nothing was sometimes the best treatment in an era where cures included mercury and bloodletting. Speaking of harm, let's talk about the Victorian obsession with curing sexuality. This was an era where anything outside the rigid norms of marriage was seen as a medical problem. Masturbation was considered a disease, blamed for everything from blindness to insanity. Doctors prescribed chastity belts, cold baths, or even surgical interventions to cure it. For men, this could mean cauterizing sensitive areas, yes, with hot irons. For women, it was worse. Clitoridectomies were still a thing, pushed by doctors like Isaac Baker Brown, who thought female hysteria was caused by overstimulation. These procedures were barbaric, often done without consent, and left lifelong physical and psychological scars. The fact that Brown was eventually kicked out of the medical establishment wasn't much comfort to his victims. The era's prudishness didn't just harm adults. Children caught in the crosshairs of moral panic faced brutal treatments to curb unnatural behaviors. Some doctors even recommended circumcision, not for hygiene, but as a punishment to deter youthful indiscretions. It's a chilling reminder that Victorian medicine wasn't just about curing disease, it was about enforcing social control, often at the cost of human dignity. Let's pivot to the pharmacy, where things were getting downright psychedelic. Cocaine was the new kid on the block and doctors loved it. It was prescribed for everything from toothaches to depression, often in the form of tonics, lozenges, or even cigarettes. Sigmund Freud was a huge fan, writing glowing reviews of cocaine's exhilarating effects before he realized it was, insanely addictive. Cocaine-laced wines like Vin Mariani were marketed as health drinks, endorsed by everyone from the Pope to Thomas Edison. Meanwhile, heroin was introduced by Bayer, yes, the aspirin people, as a non-addictive cough suppressant. Spoiler, it was very addictive. These drugs were handed out like candy, and nobody batted an eye until the bodies started piling up. The lack of regulation meant pharmacists could mix whatever they wanted, and patients had no idea what they were swallowing. Public health was still a mess, but the tides were turning. Florence Nightingale was shaking things up, revolutionizing nursing with her work during the Crimean War. She wasn't just a lady with the lamp. She was a data nerd who used statistics to prove that clean hospitals saved lives. Her charts, some of the first infographics, showed that more soldiers were dying from infections than from battle wounds. Nightingale pushed for ventilation, clean water, and basic hygiene, which sounds like common sense but was radical at the time. Hospitals started to look less like death traps and more like places you might actually leave alive. But don't get too excited. Most hospitals were still filthy, and Nightingale's ideas took years to spread. The average person was still at the mercy of a system that saw disease as a moral failing or a cosmic imbalance. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was romanticized as a beautiful death, with poets and artists swooning over pale, coughing heroines. In reality, it was a brutal killer, tearing through crowded cities where poverty and malnutrition made people easy prey. The cure? Fresh air and rest if you could afford it. If not, you got sent to a sanatorium, which was basically a fancy hospice where you waited to die. The rich could escape to the Alps or the seaside, but the poor just coughed their way to the grave. And let's not forget the epidemics. Smallpox was still a scourge, despite Edward Jenner's vaccine from the 1790s. Vaccination was controversial. Sound familiar? With anti-vaxxers claiming it was unnatural or a government plot. Meanwhile, cholera kept striking, and doctors still hadn't fully grasped that clean water was the key. The 1850s saw progress, thanks to people like John Snow, but old habits died hard. Miasma theory still had a grip, and many doctors refused to believe in germs, even as the evidence piled up. It was like arguing with a flat earther, except the stakes were thousands of lives. The Victorian era was also the age of self-help medicine, where people took matters into their own hands. Books like The People's Common Sense Medical Advisor were bestsellers, offering tips on everything from treating boils to reviving a drowned person. Spoiler, most of the advice was terrible, like blowing tobacco smoke into someone's lungs to resuscitate them. Home remedies were often just as bad as doctor's orders. Think turpentine for sore throats or raw beef for eye infections. But in a world where professionals were as likely to kill you as cure you, DIY medicine was a gamble worth taking. As we wrap up this third chapter, let's marvel at the sheer tenacity of the Victorians. They faced a medical system that was equal parts circus and slaughterhouse, yet they kept pushing forward, driven by a stubborn belief in progress. Men like Lister and Simpson were laying the groundwork for modern medicine, but the road was paved with suffering, scams, and some truly bizarre ideas. We've got one more part to go where we'll explore the final days of Victorian medicine, the dawn of real science, and the patients who somehow lived to tell the tale. Stay tuned because the absurdity is far from over. Welcome back to the final act of our descent into the chaotic, blood-soaked circus of Victorian medicine, where survival was less about science and more about dodging the doctor's best attempts to cure you. Picture yourself in 1860s London, stumbling through streets thick with coal smoke, your stomach churning from last night's dubious patent tonic, and a creeping dread that your next cough might land you under a surgeon's rusty blade. This is part 4, where we'll witness the slow, painful birth of modern medicine, marvel at the stubborn absurdity of old-school quackery, and salute the poor souls who somehow lived through it all. The roller coaster's almost over, but it's got a few more stomach-dropping twists. Let's dive in. By the 1860s, the cracks in the Victorian medical system were starting to show, and a few bright minds were finally dragging it towards something resembling science. Germ theory was gaining traction thanks to pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, who proved that tiny invisible microbes were behind the diseases that had been killing people for centuries. This was a bombshell. No more miasma nonsense about bad air. The real culprits were bacteria, lurking in dirty water, unwashed hands, and those crusty surgical tools doctors love to reuse. But don't get too excited. Most doctors still clung to their old ways like a toddler to a blanket. Change was slow, and the body count was high. Joseph Lister, our antiseptic hero from part 3, was still fighting the good fight, spraying carbolic acid on everything and proving that clean surgeries saved lives. His work was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough to overhaul a system built on arrogance and tradition. Surgeons still operated in theaters packed with gawking spectators, and many saw Lister's obsession with cleanliness as a personal insult. Imagine being called out for not washing your hands when your coat's so stiff with dried blood it could stand up on its own. It was a tough sell, but Lister's patients were surviving, and that was hard to ignore. Meanwhile, anesthesia was becoming more common, but it was still a wild west. Chloroform and ether were lifesavers, letting patients sleep through the horror of surgery. But dosing was more art than science. Too little, and you'd wake up mid-amputation, screaming like a banshee. Too much, and you'd never wake up at all. Anesthetists, often just a surgeon's assistant with a bottle and a rag, were playing a high-stakes game of guesswork. And even when the anesthesia worked, infection was still the real killer. Hospitals were starting to clean up their act thanks to people like Florence Nightingale, whose data-driven crusade made it clear that filth equaled death. Her push for ventilation, clean linens, and trained nurses was turning hospitals from charnel houses into places where you had a fighting chance. But progress was patchy. Charity hospitals for the poor were still overcrowded, underfunded, and reeking of despair, while the private clinics for the rich offered better odds but no guarantees. The class divide was stark. If you had money, you might get a clean bed and a doctor who'd at least heard of germ theory. If you didn't, you were lucky to get a straw mattress and a prayer. Let's talk about the patients, because they're the real MVPs of this nightmare. Surviving Victorian medicine required a constitution of iron and a will to live that could outlast a leech attack. Take the case of Fanny Burney, a novelist who underwent a mastectomy in 1811 before anesthesia. She described lying on a table, fully conscious as the surgeon cut away, her screams drowned out by the ticking of a clock. She survived somehow, and wrote about it with a clarity that makes your skin crawl. Or consider the countless women who endured childbirth in filthy conditions, only to die of puerperal fever because their doctor didn't bother to wash his hands. Ignaz Semmelweis, the hand-washing advocate we met earlier, was still a tragic footnote. His ideas were mocked, and he died in an asylum, driven mad by a world that refused to listen. But by the 1860s, his theories were starting to gain ground, saving lives one clean hand at a time. The quackery, though, was still in full swing. Patent medicines were bigger than ever, with brands like Carter's Little Liver Pills, promising to cure everything from constipation to torpid liver, whatever that meant. These pills were often just laxatives spiked with alcohol or opium, but the marketing was genius. Colorful ads filled newspapers featuring testimonials from cured patients who probably never existed. Holloway's ointment claimed to heal wounds, tumors, and even bad dreams, while Ayer's sarsaparilla was sold as a blood purifier that could fix your entire life. People drank this stuff by the gallon, not realizing they were often just getting drunk or high. The government still didn't regulate these potions, so the market was a free-for-all, with snake oil salesmen raking in fortunes while their customers dropped like flies. And let's not forget the cure-alls for women. Products like Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription promised to fix female complaints, a vague term that covered everything from cramps to nervousness. These were mostly alcohol and herbs, but the ads played on Victorian anxieties about women's health, implying that any deviation from perfect docility was a medical emergency. The misogyny was baked into the system. Doctors still diagnosed hysteria for anything from anxiety to ambition, and treatments ranged from bed rest to institutionalization. Asylums were still dumping grounds for anyone who didn't fit society's mold, with treatments like ice baths, spinning chairs, or even early electroshock therapy. The line between medicine and punishment was blurry at best. Dentistry was still a horror show, but there were glimmers of progress. By the 1870s, proper dental schools were popping up, and some dentists were using early forms of anesthesia for extractions. But for most people, a toothache still meant a visit to a barber surgeon or a street vendor with a pair of pliers and a questionable track record. Tooth powders laced with abrasives like chalk or even ground bone were still common, wearing down enamel faster than they cleaned. And if you wanted a filling, good luck. Early fillings were made of lead or mercury amalgam, which could poison you slowly while you chewed. False teeth were a status symbol, often made from porcelain or, creepily, real teeth pulled from corpses or sold by the desperate poor. The phrase, "smile and bear it," must have been invented by someone who just paid for a set of secondhand chompers. Public health was finally starting to catch up, but it was a slog. The 1875 Public Health Act in Britain forced cities to clean up their act, mandating sewers, clean water, and better housing. Cholera outbreaks were becoming less frequent, thanks to heroes like Jon Snow, whose water pump stunt proved that contaminated water was the real villain. Smallpox vaccination was becoming more accepted, though anti-vaxxers still spread fear with pamphlets about cowpox poison. Tuberculosis was still a killer, but sanatoriums were popping up, offering fresh air and rest as a last-ditch effort. The poor, as always, got the short end of the stick. Cramped tenements, bad food, and no access to fancy treatments meant they were still dying in droves. The Victorian obsession with progress was both their salvation and their curse. Every new discovery was hyped as the cure to end all cures, but old habits died hard. Take phrenology, the pseudoscience of reading bumps on your skull to diagnose your character or health. It was nonsense, but doctors and quacks alike used it to justify everything from hiring decisions to asylum commitments. Or consider mesmerism, which was still kicking around, with practitioners claiming they could hypnotize you into health. These fads were fading, but they still had a grip on a public desperate for answers. Even legitimate advances like the X-ray in the 1890s came with a catch. Nobody realized radiation could harm you, so early X-ray operators often ended up with burns or worse. The era's optimism was infectious, but so were its diseases. Let's not forget the social side of medicine. Doctors were starting to organize, forming professional groups like the British Medical Association to weed out the worst quacks and set standards. But these groups were also gatekeepers, keeping women and minorities out of the profession. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Britain's first female doctor, had to fight tooth and nail to get her degree, sneaking into lectures and enduring constant harassment. Her success was a beacon, but it was a lonely one. Most women were still relegated to nursing or midwifery, roles seen as lesser despite their life-saving work. The class system permeated everything. Rich patients got house calls and fancy tonics, while the poor got charity wards and experimental treatments. As we close out this final chapter, let's tip our hats to the Victorians who survived this medical gauntlet. They faced a world where a cough could mean death, a doctor's visit could mean disaster, and a cure could mean poison. Yet they kept going, driven by a stubborn belief that tomorrow would be better. And in a way, they were right. The seeds planted by Lister, Nightingale, and others would grow into the modern medicine we take for granted. Sterile surgeries, vaccines, antibiotics, and a world where hysteria isn't a diagnosis. But the cost was staggering, paid in blood, pain, and lives, lost to a system that was as much a gamble as it was a science. So, next time you pop an aspirin or get a flu shot, spare a thought for the Victorian patients who endured the leeches, the laudanum, and the lunatic asylums. They didn't just survive, they paved the way for us to live. And with that, our journey through the nightmare of Victorian medicine comes to an end. Thanks for sticking with me through the gore, the gadgets, and the grim reality of a world where staying healthy was the ultimate act of defiance. In the dank, makeshift lavatory of a bombed-out farmhouse, a lone soldier's mother clutches a tin basin of icy water, hesitating before washing, because the soap she's been rationed this week was snatched by her husband to scrub his grime-clotted boots. Welcome to the world where a bath was a myth, and survival smelled like desperation. Dignity dangling by a frayed soap thread. She spent days crammed in a cattle car, the straw beneath her bunched into a lumpy mattress for her and 3 children. The only restroom? The open air between the rails where snatches of countryside breeze met the stench of human waste. She worries her daughter will fall into the shallow ditch below as she squats, tugging at her skirt's hem, glancing over her shoulder for the ever-encroaching soldier's boots. No polite hush of flushing, only the rattling train and her own frantic heartbeat. Back at the village school-turned-hospital, a young nurse named Katrin leans against a stained basin, dipping a rag into foul-smelling water to scrub down a wounded foot. The soldier moans. She washes away the blood but can't remove the odor of rot. A dare among nurses declares that soaking one's feet in urine will stave infection. A repulsive tip purloined from medieval chronicles. Katrin hesitates, then lifts a tin can, eyes watering as she tips yellow liquid around her ankles. It stings, but next morning, her feet feel oddly invigorated. Meanwhile, in a cramped London shelter, Mrs. Jenkins watches her daughter fiddle with a makeshift brush of twigs, attempting to coax lice from her tangled hair. No shampoo, no hot water, only a bowl of cold, tepid dribble from the communal tap, shared by 30 families. The daughter's scalp is a battlefield, each nit a triumphant invader. Mrs. Jenkins resorts to painting her head with kerosene to smother them, then wrapping her hair in oilcloth to bake them out. The child howls, eyes squeezed shut, but by dawn the scalp is clear and slick, shiny, smelling of lamps. Victory tastes like hydrocarbons. In the bombed-out ruins of Warsaw, Danuta, a seamstress turned partisan, scavenges a hidden stash of cloth scraps to fashion sanitary pads. With no sanitary products available, every month becomes a trial by blood. She layers stained linens, secures them with twine, then buries the soiled versions in the garden, hoping the fresh potatoes growing there won't taste of iron. She remembers her mother's stories of mustard and water to alleviate cramps, and so brews a bitter tea, wincing at each sip as it scorches her throat. Relief mingles with regret. Even painkillers are luxuries reserved for the rich or the wounded. On the Russian front, amidst endless snow and mud, Soviet women in uniform learn to freeze-dry their hair rather than wash it. Water is so scarce that a single bucket means survival. So instead, each evening, they rub their scalps with handfuls of fine sand, hoping the gritty particles will absorb excess oil. At dawn, they shake out the grains into the frost, creating little sand mounds like miniature tank fortifications. The method is hell on hair, but keeps the scalp from feeling like a grease trap, if only for a day. In Paris, where glamour once flickered in café lights, Madame Beauchamp runs a clandestine beauty parlor. By torchlight in a hidden cellar, she mixes glycerin from stolen military supplies with ash from charred furniture to create a rudimentary face mask. Clients emerge pale, patchy, smelling of campfire. Her pièce de résistance is a perfumed concoction of wildflowers and soaked cigarette butts, an aroma that hints at violets until the ashy undertone sneaks in. It sells for rations of chocolate and cigarettes, and women line up in bomb shelters, willing to ingest mold spores for a fleeting sense of normalcy. In an English POW camp, civilian internees endure abysmal latrine queues. When the latrine hut collapses under the weight of too many bodies, they resort to digging shallow holes beside the barbed wire, only to discover the red earth teems with worms that creep into their trousers. One woman decides to wrap her legs in oiled canvas to keep them at bay. At night, she lies awake listening to the squirm of creatures against her skin, imagining they whisper, "You can't escape us." Over in Italy, displaced women squat in olive groves, boiling laundry in a blackened pot over open flames. Lye soap is rationed to near zero, so they scavenge ashes from artillery burns, mix them with animal fat, and mold crude bars. The soap is abrasive as sandpaper, tearing at fabric and skin alike. After scrubbing shifts-worn uniforms, they rinse hands in cooling rainwater and watch expectantly as bruises from the lye vanish, only to leave behind chapped, red welts. In the heart of Berlin, high society ladies masquerade through powdered wigs and underarm pads gifted by sympathetic factory workers. The pads are postcards of ingenuity, layers of diaper-like paper stitched together from prized cigarettes packaging. A whiff of perfume masks the inevitable whiff of sweat. A faint curl of tobacco paper peeks out, a secret handshake among women of privilege and privilege loss alike. And in the Scandinavian frost, refugee women travel miles to fetch bathwater from a communal borehole, hauling buckets that freeze solid before they reach the ice shift bars. They break the ice with fists, tip water into a footbath hollowed in snow, and stand on one foot at a time to avoid tipping. The frostbite risk is high, but the jab of cold is a reminder they're alive enough to feel each bone crack under the icy baptism. Back in Normandy, as Allied forces roll in, a French mother uses the tides to scrub her children's faces. She dips them into the cold channel, lathering soap made from coconut oil sent in Red Cross parcels. The waves strip mud and lice alike, but the salt water burns open cuts. Her daughter's wails mingle with distant artillery booms. Survival, she realizes, is a patchwork of agony and relief, sewn together with the frayed threads of hope. These women, scattered across continents and ideologies, embody the absurdity of hygiene in wartime, where water is more precious than gold, soap a currency, and cleanliness a cruel joke. Their innovations, sand scrubs, urine soaks, kerosene washes, reveal not just desperation, but defiantly human creativity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. Each method, disgusting as it may be, offers a fleeting victory over the stench of war, a testament to willpower that shimmers through the grime. So the next time you grip a warm shower head, remember the mothers, nurses, partisans, and refugees who gambled with infection and frostbite to scrub a semblance of cleanliness from their bodies. Their methods may make you gag, but their courage should make you stand a little straighter, or at least reach for that bar of soap with a newfound appreciation. Brace yourself. If you think your morning routine is rough, imagine smearing your face with smoldering chicken dung and calling it skincare. For the next 10 minutes, you're about to dive into the next chapter of wartime women's hygiene nightmares. She's a telephone operator in 1943 London, working double shifts in a dank underground bunker. Her legs ache from standing. Her hair is plastered to her scalp by invisible waves of trench foot bacteria, and she has exactly 1 tin of Ovaltine-scented soap for the week. As the air raid sirens wail overhead, she liberates half her roommate's ration of margarine, because fat, she's learned, dissolves grime almost as well as soap. She warms it in her palms, rubs it over her arms and underarms, and wipes away the oily residue on the corner of a newspaper. The neighbors have begun calling her the oily angel, though ironically, the slickness attracts more lice than it banishes. Meanwhile, in the North African desert, a wren, the Women's Royal Naval Service recruit, has to contend with sand not just in her boots, but everywhere. With water rationed to a pint a day for bathing and cooking combined, her daily ablution is a brisk wrist and elbow scrub under a trickle from a kerosene-powered pump. She resorts to what she calls insurgent exfoliation. She scrapes her arms with a flat piece of discarded metal, harvesting layers of dirt and dead skin until she bleeds, then slathers herself with a paste of ground coffee and hot sand. The paste burns like the Sahara sun, but afterwards she feels triumphant. She smells of mocha and grit, and at least her face is free of dust mites. Back in Soviet Russia's frozen wasteland, a nurse named Irina fashions a makeshift sauna inside a half-destroyed hut. She builds a mound of red-hot stones over a pit, then seals the doorway with quilted epaulets and fur collars. Despite the risk of asphyxiation, she orders 7 other women in her field hospital to stand in the steam chamber, passing around a single bucket of water mixed with pine resin. The resin fumes open their sinuses and singe their lungs, but afterward, they feel as if they've bathed in the Volga itself. In reality, they've inhaled a toxic cloud, and by dawn, 4 are coughing up bits of stone. On the Greek islands, evacuated school teachers gather sea sponges for a communal scrub. They've heard that salt water is antiseptic, but no one warned them about the jellyfish tentacles hidden in the algae. As they scrub arms and legs, they discover new nerve endings, an electric agony that lasts hours. Someone suggests wrapping vinegar-soaked rags around the stings to dull the pain. Another scoffs, recommending urine instead. The teachers cannot decide which kitchen liquid is more offensive, so they alternate, laughing hysterically through tears, until every scrap of dignity is washed away alongside the jellyfish slime. In occupied Norway, a teenage partisan named Anne has no toothbrush. She chews on a piece of birch bark, the fibrous strand scraping away plaque as she hums a lullaby from her childhood. When she's alone, she steals a sip of her father's schnapps and rinses, calling it liquid courage for the mouth. She knows it's pointless. Her gums bleed. Her breath could fell a moose. But it's better than nothing, and tomorrow she'll smile at the Gestapo checkpoint with a mouth so stank it'll knock out any suspicion. Meanwhile, in a French orphanage turned refugee camp, Sister Marguerite encounters a lice epidemic so ferocious it's considered biological warfare by the children. With no delousing powder, she boils lavender leaves and onion skins in water, then instructs the girls to soak their pigtails. The concoction leaves their hair smelling like rat poison and colored a sickly green. The kids stagger out of the wash hall looking like forest spirits gone mad, but at least the lice drown in the botanical brew, though the onion fumes have blistered their eyes and the lavender has stung their throats. In the East End of London, factory girls making munitions drink water so sulfuric that rinsing their mouths leaves a rash on their lips. They resort to dinner mint diplomacy. They chew on the brass shavings scraped from shell casings to act as abrasive mouth fresheners. It's the only mint-like sensation they'll get until VE Day. Their teeth grate, the metal fragments embed in their gums, and they develop smiles that could diffuse a bomb. On the Italian front, a housewife named Rosa must bathe her 4 children in a single basin of water, sullied by soot from nightly bombings. She boils the water over an open flame, but it still reeks of charred timber. To keep it from turning entirely black, she tosses in handfuls of lavender and eucalyptus leaves stolen from a nearby monastery's garden. The scent mixes with the smoke, creating an ungodly perfume that lingers in the folds of her children's clothes. She'll wash those again with a cloth ragging of donkey dung next week. Until then, they'll carry that ashy aroma like a badge of honor. Across the Pacific, in Japanese-occupied China, a refugee named May uses rice water to wash her face. After soaking rice to feed her siblings, she saves the starchy water, believing the old wives' tale that it brightens skin. Instead, it attracts the flies. She sets up a small screen of bamboo, but the flies find every gap. She flicks them away with a fan fashioned from old propaganda leaflets. Each flap of the paper wafts slogans like honor and purity around her. Her face may be bright, but her patience is gone. In the American South, a young black enterprising woman working in a munitions plant is denied access to proper bathroom facilities due to segregation. She carries a chamber pot hidden under her workbench, emptying it at dawn into a broken cistern outside the factory gates. For deodorant, she rubs herself with cornstarch and a dash of lilac oil, an illicit luxury smuggled from her aunt's house. She alternates lilac with peppermint, creating a confusing aura of scents that both masks the ammonia and draws curious glances from her white colleagues, who whisper rumors of her exotic hygiene rituals. She sends home letters describing the daily grind. The shower you sent in a care package is still sealed in its box, gathering dust. I use it only to hold my pencils now. Her mother replies with a crisp cotton handkerchief soaked in turpentine and rose water. The mixture is a dubious substitute for disinfectant. It burns like acid but kills any bacteria courageous enough to linger. When the turpentine runs out, she adds a few drops of kerosene to the rose water, creating a cocktail that scents like a naval dockyard. In Cairo, British nurses stationed near the Suez Canal battle scorpions and sand fleas in their bivouac tents. Showers are 2 buckets of water hoisted above head level, so cold the skin cracks. One nurse invents blanket bathing. She stands wrapped in a canvas sheet, while another nurse pours warm, diluted alcohol from lamps into the folds. The alcohol evaporates instantly, cooling the skin while killing off fleas, but at the cost of a permanent sunburn and a cough that rattles her chest. In the vast encampments of the U.S., Army in England, private women recruits, overlooked by basic facilities, use chemical toilets designed for trucks. The smell inside these aluminum canisters is so oppressive that women hold their breath and do barrel rolls to lessen contact with the fumes. One brave recruit fashions a charcoal filter from cigarette ashes and pantyhose. She hangs it at the air vent, claiming she can now endure a full 2 minutes inside the latrine without passing out. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front again, Russian farmers' wives ride in horse-drawn carts to collect snow for washing clothes and bathing. They let the snow melt in iron barrels heated by wood fires, making a slushy sludge. Into this they add handfuls of crushed pine needles and beet juice, the latter for color and the former for fragrance. The bathwater swirls red and green, reminding them of Christmas trees. For a moment, survival becomes magical, until the steam reveals ragged uniforms floating like drowned ghosts. In the heart of Berlin, underground and bomb shelters beneath the Reichstag, high society women risk Gestapo raids to purchase real silk stockings turned into head wraps. With no shampoo, they pull the fragile silk over their heads, use it as a scrub cloth, and then hang it out as a drying cap. Each day, the gentlest scrub with the silkiest wrap makes them feel like aristocrats defying ruin. They trade their silk scraps for a sip of cognac, or sometimes for the simple joy of admiring themselves in a broken mirror. And on the battered Greek mainland, a schoolteacher who's become a guerrilla courier stops at each tavern to filch leftover olive oil. She stores it in flattened ammunition cans and uses it to condition her hands, cracked from passing envelopes. When war ends, she'll sell that oil to a local apothecary, because in her mind, the very grease that kept her hands from bleeding is worth its weight in gold. These vignettes, as repulsive as they sound, capture the grim ingenuity of women clinging to cleanliness in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. From muddy trenches to scorched towns, from luxury bomb shelters to segregated factories, each method was a talisman against disease, despair, and dehumanization. No matter the cost, sunburn, infection, chemical burns, or the nausea that follows a mouth rinse of kerosene, they scrubbed on because hygiene in war was never about vanity. It was about survival, about guarding the thin line between life and an existence so filthy it barely felt human. So next time you rail against a lukewarm shower or grumble over an empty vanity shelf, remember these stories. Recall the greasy mothers, the desert scrubs, the scorpion-tented tent saunas. Their dedication to hygiene amid bombs and bloodshed is the absurd thread that binds history's darkest days, an invitation to appreciate the simple joy of soap, water, and a little dignity. She wakes before dawn, muscles stiff from the night spent on straw in a makeshift barrack. The air smells of mold and despair. With a trembling hand, she scoops a ladle of tepid well water into a tin basin and adds 2 spoonfuls of mustard seed. Her grandmother swore it was an antiseptic. The concoction fizzes in the bowl. She submerges her feet, expecting relief. Instead, the mustard burns like a branding iron. She yanks them out, water sloshing onto the dirt floor, and hops on one foot, testing the pain. The blistered soles throb, but at least they're cleanish. Across the barbed wire fence in the women's compound of a forced labor camp, Sister Helena scavenges wood from broken pallets to build a rudimentary shower stall. It's little more than 4 slats nailed together, a tin roof, and a hole for drainage. Each day, she gets exactly 1 bucket of cold water, poured over her head in a shivering cascade. To warm the water, she perches the bucket atop heated stones, risking scalding burns. She reckons the benefit is worth the risk. Clean skin seems worth a singed elbow. Afterwards, she rubs her body with handfuls of dried lichen, its rough texture scraping away the grime of the previous week. Meanwhile, in the dusty fields of Burma, a Burmese resistance fighter named I fashions a toothbrush from bamboo and scrub bristles woven from palm fibers. There's no toothpaste, only ash from burnt rice husks. Each morning, she dips the brush in ash and scrubs her teeth until her gums bleed slightly. It tastes of char and regret, but it's better than nothing. At night, she rinses with salt water from a muddy stream, hoping the salt kills bacteria. Instead, it stings open wounds in her gums, but again she endures. Anything to keep her teeth intact, even if they rattle like rat bones. In the heart of London's blackout, Miss Thompson, a typist for the Ministry of Information, has no access to hot water. Her building's boiler was bombed weeks ago. She fills a kettle on a Primus stove, heating water until it's just warm enough to steam. The steam alone becomes her shower. She stands naked in the tiny bathroom, faces a dripping tap, and lets the steam flood the room. She inhales the wet heat, thinking of tropical rain, but her hair remains limp, greasy, and full of soot from the nearby munitions plant. She ends the ritual by rubbing her scalp with a paste of ground oatmeal and tea leaves, an attempt to exfoliate. The kitchen merges with the bathroom. Dishes soak in the same bowl where she washed her feet. On the eastern front, in a women's artillery unit, Comrade Ivanova teaches her platoon the snowmelt scrub. They trek through waist-high drifts, gather snow in mess tins, and pause at a makeshift stove powered by wood scraps. The snow melts into slushy water tinted brown from rusted tin. They dip cloth strips in it and wrap them around their necks, forearms, and calves to absorb sweat and grime. Each wrap is worn until sodden, then replaced with a new strip. The kills the itch of lice but leaves them smelling like wet burlap. The stench clings for days. Meanwhile, in occupied Belgium, Elise, a mother of 5, uses her eldest daughter's doll clothes as rags to scrub the children's faces each evening. The doll clothes are made of unbleached cotton, softer than linen but stain easily. Elise soaks them in rainwater collected from a leaking roof and rubs dirty noses and grimy cheeks until the rags turn brown. She washes the rags in the same basin the children used to bathe, an inch of water used in rotation, first the littlest, then the next, until even the eldest's feet tread water already murky with dirt. In North Africa's heat, the women of a field kitchen devise a sugar scrub to tackle sweat and dust. They combine coarse sugar, stolen from Red Cross packets, with olive oil pilfered from supply convoys. Each woman gratefully rubs the gritty paste over her arms and legs, scrubbing until skin shines. The process is abrasive. Small cuts appear on knees and elbows. They laugh through tears as the sugar dissolves into sticky rivulets, dripping down their legs. Afterward, they rinse with a trickle of water from a 5-gallon drum. What remains is sugar residue that attracts ants, which they flick off like tiny, insistent hitchhikers. In the winding alleys of Rome, Angelica, a displaced seamstress, fashions hairnets from abandoned fishing nets. Lacking pins or combs, she wraps the net over her head and fastens it with safety pins swiped from military uniforms. To clean her hair, she tips rice vinegar into a basin of cold water, knowing it dulls the scalp's oil, and dips her gloved hands into the mix, massaging strands. The vinegar smell is overwhelming, drawing stares from passers-by. After rinsing, she spritzes beer from cans looted from officers' quarters. The yeast supposedly strengthens her hair. Instead, her scalp itches and the beer foams in her locks, as if ready to spill like sudsy beer at a toga party gone wrong. On the islands of the Pacific, a group of Navy nurses digs a pit latrine above the high tide line to avoid muck. But each morning, the ocean reclaims half the trench, and they must scrape out sand and seaweed before it can be used. One nurse, Lieutenant Carter, repurposes kerchiefs as toilet paper, boiling them each night in Lysol solution scavenged from the dispensary. The cloths hang stiff and greenish by dawn. She uses them sparingly, each swipe a reminder of the length to which they must go for a semblance of hygiene. Meanwhile, in the factories of Nazi Germany, women forced into armaments work endure long shifts with no bathroom breaks. They improvise desk latrines, a chamber pot hidden under a false bottom in their workbench. They swap notes on how to mask the odor, coffee grounds, cigarette ash, even the crushed petals of roses seized from the Gestapo horticultural display. Each morning, the coffee grinder hums with a mixture of grounds and industrial dust. The resulting brew is undrinkable, but the grounds under the latrine pot absorb enough smell to delay discovery. They call it rosy urinal diplomacy. Across the Mediterranean, in the mountainous villages of Yugoslavia, partisan women collect pine sap to create an ointment for their feet. Endless marches in wool socks and leather boots leave them with cracked heels. They melt sap over embers, cool it slightly, then smear the amber goo into crevices. The sap hardens into a protective shell overnight. In the morning, they peel it away like stinging boot casts. Each peel brings tears. Sap clings to skin with the tenacity of barbed wire, but it seals cracks against infection. In the devastated streets of Rotterdam, a mother named Johan fixes her son's hair each morning with a handful of lard salvaged from butcher's crates. She warms it between her palms, smears it through his curls, then combs with a fork to detangle. Lice drown in the lard. Hair glistens like a modern art installation. The stink wafts through bombed-out alleyways, drawing contempt from neighbors. But Johan smiles. Her boy looks neat, and neatness is rebellion in a city reduced to rubble. In the American home front, a factory worker in Detroit named Ruth faces weekday shifts in a plant that glows red from molten steel. She brings a glass jar of homemade deodorant, crushed alum mixed with lemon juice. Each morning, she dips a finger into the jar, applying the paste under her arms into her neck. By lunch, the paste has reacted with sweat, forming a crust that flakes off onto her uniform. She shakes it away, revealing white streaks that sparkle in the fluorescent lights. She looks like a ghost, but at least she doesn't reek. In the jungles of Papua New Guinea, an Australian nurse battles mosquito-borne fevers and perpetual humidity. She fashions mosquito nets into bathing robes, wrapping her body in fine mesh to protect against bite marks. She fills a feeding tube with coconut oil, squirts it onto her skin, and rubs it in vigorously, hoping the oil barrier wards off insects. Instead, it just makes her slide around when she tries to wash, the mesh clinging, the oil transferring to every surface she touches. She ends up covered head to toe in itching clouds of mosquitoes, and still her skin feels like a grease trap. Back in Berlin, as the Soviet army closes in, Elsa, a once wealthy socialite turned courier, melts down the last of her lipstick bullets, red-tipped ammunition given as gifts, and mixes them with vehicle grease stolen from a tank. She applies the sludge to her face as a rudimentary blush, scrubbing off the previous day's grime in the process. The lead in the bullets poisons her skin. Her cheeks swell and itch. Yet she grins through the pain. Her face looks alive again, as if she still belongs to the world she once ruled. Meanwhile, in Vichy, France, women in rural kitchens use mortar and pestle to crush lavender and thyme into fine powders, then sprinkle the botanicals into sloshing wash basins. The mild scent masks the stench of bleach used to clean floorboards. They call it Provençal luxury. Each dip releases a puff of herbal aroma until a cat dashes through, yanking the cloth into a corner and leaving a smear of orange fur across the once pristine linen. On the U.S. West Coast, Japanese-American internees in relocation camps endure showers so infrequent that they ration water for bath days. 1 tray of soapy water per detainee each week. Women trade slices of washcloths like currency, a small strip to scrub knuckles, another to sponge the face. They bath in shifts, each wiping the basin clean before passing it along. They use filtered tea bags as poultices for chapped lips and cracked elbows, tucking the used tea leaves into bandages. And in the winding tunnels beneath Malta, hearing their island home battered by Axis bombers, nurses in red crosses dig trenches to channel water runoff. They fill rusted steel drums with this rainwater, then heat it over oil lamps. At night, they gather in dim corners, shedding clothes to warm in the steam. Afterward, they brush themselves with handfuls of volcanic ash roped in burlap sacks, burlap generously donated by the British Army. The ash feels like fine grit, seeping beneath nails and into every wrinkle. But they giggle as they clatter around, a black dust marking their lips and hair. They look like charcoal sketches of themselves. These women, scattered like embers across continents aflame, endured scalding mustard baths, lard hairdos, and bleach-starved basins. Their bodies were canvases for the absurd artistry of survival, of mustard seeds and sap, of ash and ammonia, of sugar scrubs and lard pomades. Each method was grotesque and ingenious, a testament to willpower and the human capacity to find cleanliness in the unlikeliest of places. They scrubbed, they stained, they scalded, and above all, they persevered, because in the crucible of war, hygiene was not a luxury, but a lifeline, flung across fields of ruin like a bar of soap too precious to waste. The dawn light filters through the shattered window pane as she sits on the lip of the trough, her legs dangling over the edge, feet swollen from standing on frozen ground. She pulls a handful of straw from the bedding and stuffs it into a fraying sock, creating a makeshift foot wringer. Gathering what little water remains in the trough, she pours it over her straw-filled sock, squeaking as fibers shift against skin. The sock, soaked, becomes a sponge that mops up the festering blood beneath her toenails. When she peels it off, the straw is red and sticky. When she pulls at it, bits of straw cling to the ragged edges of her cuticles. She grits her teeth and dips it again, repeating until the water runs murky brown. Clean or no, the pain is sharp enough to remind her she's alive. At the edge of the English Channel, in a fisherman's hut commandeered for evacuees, Eileen stands knee-deep in a metal wash basin. It's filled with clamshells and small stones collected from the beach. She discovered that the abrasive shells help scrub away dried blood and grime from her baby's face. With one hand, she holds her wailing child. With the other, she scoops handfuls of shells, pressing and swirling them across her son's cheeks. Tiny cuts form at the jawline, trickling mucky tears into his eyes. Eileen blinks back her guilt and redips. When she's done, the boy's face is pink and raw, cheeks exfoliated of newborn softness. He's cleaner, yes, though his cry is one of fury, not hunger. Inside a dank Parisian cellar, a group of women huddle around a kerosene lamp, passing a single canister of rose water. They each dip a corner of their skirt hem into the fragrance, then lift it to their faces as a makeshift compress. The rose water is a luxury, smuggled from a perfumery whose door has been sealed by occupying troops. Its scent is sweet enough to choke on, but each inhalation is a momentary reprieve from the stench of rats and mold. When the hem of the skirt runs dry, it's dipped again. When the rose water runs out, they pass the empty canister like a solemn relic, remembering the scent of home. In a bombed-out Berlin apartment, Greta collects hair clippings discarded from the local hairdresser, who's still cutting the wealthy despite rationing. She fills a jar with the pale blonde strands, packs them tight to compress air, When she needs to clean her own hair, she fashions a crown of the clippings, ties it with string around her scalp, and walks through a smoky room until the clippings darken with soot. Then she rinses her head by pouring water from a chipped teapot. The soot-laden hair traps grease and lice alike. She shakes her head vigorously. Clumps of hair tumble out, mingling with the clippings she'll reuse next week. It's cyclical, unsanitary, and yet the least abhorrent option in a city where anything clean is suspect. On the eastern front, in a pillbox carved from frozen earth, a squad of women soldiers share a single mirror, a chunk of broken glass taped to a plank. They clean it by wiping with their undershirts, each shirt carrying the sweat and musk of 1,000 marches. The mirror is small, only enough to see one eye at a time, so they take turns. One squats beneath it and adjusts her cap. Another checks her teeth for fragments of rationed bread. The cleaning cloths darken with oil and grime. Eventually, the surface hazes, but they press on, spitting on it when necessary to clear a spot. Each reflection, however foggy, is a defiant reminder that they still exist as individuals, not just cogs in an endless war machine. In the dusty marketplace of Aleppo, a woman named Fatima balances a ceramic basin on her hip while weaving through crowds. The basin holds water mixed with ash and vinegar, her antidote for the ceaseless dust that coats her face. She uses a scrap of muslin as a mask over her mouth, soaking it in the mixture before pressing it into place. As she breathes, the vinegar stings her lungs, but the ash filters the dust. When she removes the mask, the muslin is gray and heavy. She shakes it out, re-soaks, and replaces. The market stalls blur around her, but her breath stays cleaner than the rest. In an Italian monastery turned field hospital, Sister Lucia improvises slippers from burlap sacks and strips of rubber scavenged from tires. The marble floors are gone, replaced by bare earth churned by stretcher bearers. She warms water on an oil burner and fills a basin, then slathers her feet in olive oil before stepping onto the burlap. The rough fabric scrubs away grime as she shuffles in place. Afterward, she rinses the oil and dirt off with tepid water, then pats her feet dry with the burlap strips. It's a crude pedicure, one that leaves her toes glistening and her soles torn, but she claims relief in each soft thump on the bare ground. Across the Pacific on Guadalcanal, a Navy Corps woman named Grace uses her medical knowledge to brew a tea from boiled guava leaves. She pours the dark liquid over her head, believing it deters sandflies. The water is so hot she must stand on tiptoes to avoid scalding her shoulders. The leaves release a pungent aroma that clings to her skin. Sandflies dodge it for a moment, then return, attracted by the sweat beneath. Grace swears the cure is real, but she still scratches until her skin bleeds, then treats the wounds with guava leaf paste. Each application sears, like tiny embers pressed to raw meat. In a refugee convoy snaking through the Balkans, a Serbian mother named Milena uses her children's hairbrush to comb the dust out of her own hair. The brush has metal bristles, each tipped with rust. She leans her head against the truck's cold metal side, pressing the brush in and running it through her thick locks. The bristles snag knots and peel skin from her scalp. When she lifts the brush, it's caked with red dust and rust flakes. She inspects her scalp in the reflection of a spoon. Where there should be shine, there are scabs. She rubs the spit from her mouth across the spots, then hides the brush, fearing the children will demand too. In London's East End, evacuees living in cramped brick shelters share a single communal towel. After each bath, a woman shakes the towel until it's dry enough to pass on. But dryness doesn't kill bacteria, so each subsequent user rubs their body with a layer of silk borrowed from undergarments hidden in coat pockets. The silk slips between skin and towel, creating a humid microclimate that breeds fleas. Women complain of relentless bites, but no one dares refuse the shared towel. Better a bit of fleas than nothing at all. Back in Normandy, as the Allied advance clatters through the countryside, a French farm wife named Colette washes her hair in the open air, using dew collected on cabbage leaves. Before dawn, she stretches broad leaves across lettuce beds, their waxy surfaces glistening with moisture. Gently, she scrapes the droplets into a bowl, marveling at the purity before pouring them slowly over her scalp. The dew is cold as mountain runoff. She shivers, but the cold wakes every follicle. Afterward, she wipes her hair with a scarf dipped in lavender water, another Red Cross gift, to ward off lice. When the U.S. soldiers arrive, they pause to watch her, astonished by hair so clean it floats like silk. In the strafed streets of Warsaw, Danuta, now a hardened veteran, teaches a dozen young women how to use wormwood as body powder. They crush dried stalks into a dusty meal, then sprinkle it down their shirts to absorb sweat and mask odor. The wormwood smells bitter and green. Under the strains of battle, it gives them a peculiar comfort. They giggle when the powder sifts through gaps in their clothes, white as sniper scopes zeroing in on their bodies. The girls call it ghost's dust, believing it will make them invisible to bullets. They're half joking, half believing. They wear it religiously. In Alexandria's back alleys, an Italian nurse named Julia rinses her face with seawater filtered through a torn sheet. She learned the trick from local fishermen who claimed their nets made the water safe. She dips the sheet into the canal, lets it hang to drip, then splashes the clear water onto her cheeks. The salt stings her eyebrows, but the rinse lifts thick layers of dust from the day's labors. She follows with a brush of olive oil to seal moisture, emerging from the alley slick-faced and briny-scented, walking straight into the mauve dusk as if nothing has changed. On the windswept plains of Siberia, a partisan named Olga borrows a leaf from the birch trees, wraps it around her fingertip, and dips into a pot of stewing pine cones. The resinous soup is a folk remedy for lice. She rubs her scalp with the stickiness until her fingers glue to her hair. The pine smell is so strong it overwhelms her own body odor. She can't tell if she smells like pine soap or death. When she pries her fingers free, she picks off congealed bits of resin, along with handfuls of lice. She watches them wriggle and crushes them under her heel as if stamping out every trace of occupation. In a bomb shelter beneath Rotterdam, a Dutch seamstress named Marika uses threads ripped from her clothes to floss her teeth. She pulls a fine line of white cotton taut between two nails on the shelter wall, then flosses in long, painful strokes. The thread is rough. Each pass scrapes at her gums, drawing blood. She rinses with a mouthful of brackish water collected from the Maas River, hoping the minerals will disinfect. Afterward, she peers at the stained cotton in the gloom, noting how badly it needs replacing. But there is no spare thread and no dentist, so she moves on to her next task, stitching repairs to the shelter's canvas roof. When the guns finally fall silent, the women will unpack their improvisations, discard the mustard, the urine buckets, the kerosene masks. They will return to warm baths and scented soaps, marveling at how clean water once flowed at will. But for now, they remain creatures of necessity, mothers scrubbing with clamshells, partisans steaming in pine huts, nurse dripping rose water, seamstress flossing on a cotton line. Every makeshift tool, every absurd ritual tells the story of resilience, of finding dignity in dirt, of forging humanity in the furnace of war. Their bodies, canvases of scars and cleansed flesh, carry the absurd beauty of survival, a testament to the lengths women went, not for vanity, but to cling to life, one gritty, grotesque scrub at a time. Imagine waking up to the sweet scent of rotting horse carcasses, human excrement, and coal smoke so thick it stains your skin gray. Welcome to Victorian London, the glittering crown jewel of the British Empire, and arguably the most unlivable hellscape to ever pass for civilization. Here, survival wasn't just a matter of luck or class, but also a matter of how well you could hold your breath while stepping over corpses in rat-infested gutters. Home, sweet home. It all begins with the streets, if you could call them that. Imagine an urban swamp paved with cobblestones only where the queen might pass, and everywhere else just a medley of mud, blood, vomit, and the occasional half-buried dog. The rain helped, if by helped, you mean it transformed these already repulsive passageways into flowing rivers of raw sewage. Don't forget the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames itself turned into an open sewer, boiling in the summer sun, so pungent that Parliament actually fled the building. But this was not an emergency. It was just another Tuesday. Now, let's take a stroll through Whitechapel, one of London's most notorious neighborhoods. Picture families crammed into single rooms, some without windows, others without floors. Walls dripped with damp, not from rain, but from the collective breath of 10 people packed like sardines, fighting off typhus and tuberculosis with the power of prayer and gin. Gin, the nectar of the damned, was cheaper than clean water and more effective at numbing both physical pain and existential dread. Entire generations raised on gin and filth, with children so malnourished their bones bent instead of broke. But wait, you say, what about waste disposal? Surely a city of millions had some system? Oh yes, it was called chamber pots, which were emptied straight out the window with a hearty shout of Gardyloo before gravity did the rest. Streets were lined with open drains, euphemistically called channels, where every bodily fluid and byproduct of human misery flowed freely, and the smell, a charming blend of ammonia, decay, and industrial soot that settled into your lungs and never left. Respiratory failure was just a polite way of saying, "Congratulations, you breathe London air." Let us not forget the fashion, corsets so tight women's ribs deformed, top hats that doubled as lice hotels, and layers of fabric designed to trap sweat, dirt, and despair. Personal hygiene was a kind of performance art. Public baths were few and far between, and the lucky could afford a weekly splash of cold water in a tin basin. Soap was a luxury, and shampoo? A foreign concept. Instead, people doused themselves in perfumes so strong they could stun an ox, masking body odor with scents like civet derived from the anal glands of wild cats. Smelling good was a privilege, smelling alive barely achievable. On to food, which was less about nutrition and more about not dying immediately. Meat, spoiled, bread, adulterated with chalk and alum. Milk, frequently cut with water from the same river where corpses floated in cholera bred. Street vendors hawked delicacies like jellied eels, sheep's head stew, and something ominously called penny pie, whose ingredients were a mystery even to the cook. For the destitute, there was gruel, a gray sludge of oats and water if you were lucky. Starvation was common, scurvy a rite of passage, housing conditions bordered on medieval. Tenements, euphemistically called rookeries, were vertical slums teeming with disease, vice, and people. Privacy was non-existent. Whole families shared beds, and often a single bed was rented in shifts. These hot beds allowed one to sleep in the residual warmth of the previous occupant, assuming you weren't woken by the rats. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled, and the air inside was so fetid it could knock a man over. Fires were frequent, exits rare, and the insurance? Just hope your neighbor screamed loud enough before everything you owned turned to ash. Now, about crime. Victorian London was the birthplace of organized street gangs, pickpockets, and the occasional serial killer. Police patrols were rare in poor districts, leaving communities to fend for themselves. Robbery, assault, and murder were daily concerns, and justice was arbitrary at best. Public hangings were not just punishment, but entertainment, with crowds gathering to watch fellow Londoners dangle for crimes ranging from theft to breathing wrong in front of the wrong constable. For women, the dangers were even more grotesque. The shadow of Jack the Ripper loomed large, but he was just the most famous among many predators who stalked foggy alleyways. Even the light betrayed you. Gas lamps hissed and flickered, casting more shadow than illumination, while fog, thick, yellow, and choked with coal dust, transformed the city into a ghostly labyrinth. People vanished into the mists, never to be seen again, some falling into open sewers, others into the clutches of the countless dangers lurking in the gloom. The fog wasn't romantic, it was a curtain of death, a slow suffocation under the guise of weather. The average Londoner's day was a symphony of misery. Rise at dawn if the lice hadn't kept you up scratching all night. Eat something that resembled food, trudge through miles of sludge and smoke to a job that barely paid enough to keep you alive, and repeat. For children, life was even bleaker. Many worked in factories, crawling under machines or climbing chimneys, their small bodies perfect for tasks adults couldn't manage. Injuries were common, survival optional, healthcare a joke. Doctors were rare, hospitals rarer, and treatments ranged from bloodletting to leeches. Anesthesia was still new and unreliable, so surgery often involved more screaming than healing. Mental illness? Institutionalization in asylums that more closely resembled torture chambers, where the treatment included ice baths, beatings, and isolation. The lucky died quickly. The unlucky became part of London's ghostly underclass. The walking wounded no one noticed. And yet, amid all this horror, this cesspool of industrial ambition and inhuman suffering, people lived. They sang, they laughed, they loved. Children played in the gutters, couples strolled along the riverbank holding hands, and communities found solace in shared hardship. It was unlivable by modern standards, a nightmare painted in shades of soot and blood. But for those who called it home, Victorian London was not just a place. It was an identity forged in filth and fire, and carried with grim pride, because in a city where death waited at every corner, life was a rebellion. And nowhere did rebellion bloom so defiantly, so squalidly, as in the cracked cobblestones and shadowed alleys of the empire's greatest shame and glory, Victorian London. Imagine waking up to the sound of hooves clattering on cobblestones, mingled with the cries of vendors, the wails of the dying, and the occasional gunshot. Welcome back to Victorian London, where the air is not fit for breathing, the water not fit for drinking, and the housing not fit for rats. But this was home for millions. Let's dive deeper into this maze of misery and marvel, where every corner tells a tale of survival, scandal, and sewage. Let's begin underground, not with the sewers, though they're certainly worth a revisit, but with the London Underground, the world's first subway system, opened in 1863. A marvel of engineering, yes, but also a hellish tube of smoke and noise. Powered by coal-burning steam engines, the tunnels filled with choking soot, turning commuters into living chimney sweeps. Trains were packed, ventilation was a cruel joke, and for some, the daily ride was like a journey through Dante's Inferno, minus the poetry. Still, it beat walking through streets that doubled as open cesspools. Speaking of transportation, let's not forget the horses. London ran on horsepower, quite literally. Over 300,000 horses trotted, galloped, and died on London streets, leaving behind mountains of manure, an estimated 1,000 tons per day. The smell was relentless, and the flies, biblical. Dead horses often lay where they fell, bloating in the sun, waiting to be carted off by the overworked knackers. Pedestrians navigated this minefield of filth with long skirts and longer curses, and slipping in dung was just part of one's morning commute. Let's peek into a Victorian kitchen, a place of culinary nightmares and domestic warfare. Cooking was done over coal fires, which meant soot in your food was just seasoning. Refrigeration was non-existent, so meat was often suspect, preserved with salt or left to fate. Kitchens were small, smoky, and teeming with vermin. Rats, cockroaches, and fleas were more reliable dinner guests than your neighbors. And let's not even begin on the utensils, often rusted, unwashed, and shared by entire households. Food poisoning? Just another Tuesday. Now, consider the water situation. The Thames, as mentioned, was a bubbling broth of human waste, dead animals, and industrial runoff. Public water pumps offered an alternative, albeit not much better. Cholera outbreaks were frequent and deadly, the result of contaminated water and zero understanding of germ theory. It wasn't until Dr. John Snow, not that one, mapped cholera cases in 1854 and traced them to a single water pump that people began to realize maybe drinking sewage wasn't ideal. Laundry was a Herculean task. Washing clothes meant hauling water, boiling it over a fire, and scrubbing garments with lye soap that could melt your skin. Drying clothes in London's perpetual damp was another challenge. Lines crisscrossed tiny rooms, draping everything in a curtain of moist fabric. Mildew thrived, colors faded, and wearing clean clothes was less about hygiene and more about surviving laundry day. And underwear? Rarely washed. Most people owned one set, maybe two, worn until they disintegrated. For those who ventured out, the streets offered not just filth, but spectacle. Public executions were phased out by mid-century, but the bloodlust lingered. People flocked to see prisoners transported, fires extinguished, or buildings collapse. Street performers, often missing limbs, entertained with grotesque flair, while beggars offered every imaginable deformity for spare change. It was theater, tragedy, and survival all in one, and no one looked away. Let's now explore the fragrant world of Victorian medicine. Snake oil salesmen thrived, hawking cures for everything from baldness to syphilis. Patent medicines were laced with opium, mercury, or alcohol, sometimes all three. Laudanum, an opiate tincture, was the drug of choice, especially among the middle and upper classes. It dulled pain, soothed nerves, and slowly ruined lives. Self-medication was common, and seeing a doctor often meant facing more danger than the illness itself. Bloodletting persisted, as did purging, blistering, and other forms of sanctioned torture. Now, the fashion. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Women's dresses could catch fire from open hearths, their voluminous skirts acting like tinder. Crinolines, those hoop skirts, made sitting a hazard and walking a skill. Men weren't spared either. Tight collars could strangle, top hats caused headaches, and lead-based cosmetics poisoned slowly but surely. And shoes? Narrow, unpadded, and often worn until holes appeared. Foot rot and bunions were just the price of elegance. Romance in Victorian London was a complex affair, tangled in social rules, poverty, and disease. Marriage for love was rare among the working class. Survival was the goal. Brothels thrived, ranging from high-end establishments to squalid dens. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, with syphilis dubbed the English disease. Treatment involved mercury, leading to madness, mouth sores, and death. Women bore the brunt, often blamed for moral decay, while men carried infection from bed to bed. Entertainment offered a brief escape from the daily grind. Music halls, theaters, and pubs provided laughter, song, and booze in equal measure. But even these havens had a dark side. Fire safety was non-existent, and crowded venues often ended in stampedes or collapse. Alcoholism was rampant, fueled by cheap gin and bitter ale. Drunkenness was a way of life, a means to forget the stench, the hunger, and the crushing weight of urban despair. Let's not forget the workhouses, institutions designed to help the poor by breaking their spirits. Families were separated, meals were sparse, and labor was brutal. Workhouses were feared more than the streets. Entering one meant surrendering dignity for survival. Orphans, the elderly, and the disabled were treated as burdens, and death was often a release. These places weren't homes. They were warehouses for the unwanted, where the only escape was a pine box. And yet, amid the grime and gloom, Victorian London was alive. Its people, hardened by hardship, found ways to laugh, love, and endure. Communities forged bonds over shared suffering, and the human spirit, battered but unbroken, persisted. The city itself pulsed with a grim vitality, a testament to resilience in the face of unrelenting adversity. Victorian London was unlivable, but for those who survived it, it was home. Imagine waking up to the sound of hooves clattering on cobblestones, mingled with the cries of vendors, the wails of the dying, and the occasional gunshot. Welcome back to Victorian London, where the air is not fit for breathing, the water not fit for drinking, and the housing not fit for rats. But this was home for millions. Let's dive deeper into this maze of misery and marvel, where every corner tells a tale of survival, scandal, and sewage. Let's begin underground, not with the sewers, though they're certainly worth a revisit, but with the London Underground, the world's first subway system, opened in 1863. A marvel of engineering, yes, but also a hellish tube of smoke and noise. Powered by coal-burning steam engines, the tunnels filled with choking soot, turning commuters into living chimney sweeps. Trains were packed, ventilation was a cruel joke, and for some, the daily ride was like a journey through Dante's Inferno, minus the poetry. Still, it beat walking through streets that doubled as open cesspools. Speaking of transportation, let's not forget the horses. London ran on horsepower, quite literally. Over 300,000 horses trotted, galloped, and died on London streets, leaving behind mountains of manure, an estimated 1,000 tons per day. The smell was relentless, and the flies, biblical. Dead horses often lay where they fell, bloating in the sun, waiting to be carted off by the overworked knackers. Pedestrians navigated this minefield of filth with long skirts and longer curses, and slipping in dung was just part of one's morning commute. Let's peek into a Victorian kitchen, a place of culinary nightmares and domestic warfare. Cooking was done over coal fires, which meant soot in your food was just seasoning. Refrigeration was non-existent, so meat was often suspect, preserved with salt or left to fate. Kitchens were small, smoky, and teeming with vermin. Rats, cockroaches, and fleas were more reliable dinner guests than your neighbors. And let's not even begin on the utensils, often rusted, unwashed, and shared by entire households. Food poisoning? Just another Tuesday. Now, consider the water situation. The Thames, as mentioned, was a bubbling broth of human waste, dead animals, and industrial runoff. Public water pumps offered an alternative, albeit not much better. Cholera outbreaks were frequent and deadly, the result of contaminated water and zero understanding of germ theory. It wasn't until Dr. John Snow, not that one, mapped cholera cases in 1854 and traced them to a single water pump that people began to realize maybe drinking sewage wasn't ideal. Laundry was a Herculean task. Washing clothes meant hauling water, boiling it over a fire, and scrubbing garments with lye soap that could melt your skin. Drying clothes in London's perpetual damp was another challenge. Lines crisscrossed tiny rooms, draping everything in a curtain of moist fabric. Mildew thrived, colors faded, and wearing clean clothes was less about hygiene and more about surviving laundry day. And underwear? Rarely washed. Most people owned one set, maybe two, worn until they disintegrated. For those who ventured out, the streets offered not just filth but spectacle. Public executions were phased out by mid-century, but the bloodlust lingered. People flocked to see prisoners transported, fires extinguished, or buildings collapse. Street performers, often missing limbs, entertained with grotesque flair, while beggars offered every imaginable deformity for spare change. It was theater, tragedy, and survival all in one, and no one looked away. Let's now explore the fragrant world of Victorian medicine. Snake oil salesmen thrived, hawking cures for everything from baldness to syphilis. Patent medicines were laced with opium, mercury, or alcohol, sometimes all three. Laudanum, an opiate tincture, was the drug of choice, especially among the middle and upper classes. It dulled pain, soothed nerves, and slowly ruined lives. Self-medication was common, and seeing a doctor often meant facing more danger than the illness itself. Bloodletting persisted, as did purging, blistering, and other forms of sanctioned torture. Now, the fashion. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Women's dresses could catch fire from open hearths, their voluminous skirts acting like tinder. Crinolines, those hoop skirts, made sitting a hazard and walking a skill. Men weren't spared either. Tight collars could strangle, top hats caused headaches, and lead-based cosmetics poisoned slowly but surely. And shoes? Narrow, unpadded, and often worn until holes appeared. Foot rot and bunions were just the price of elegance. Romance in Victorian London was a complex affair, tangled in social rules, poverty, and disease. Marriage for love was rare among the working class. Survival was the goal. Brothels thrived, ranging from high-end establishments to squalid dens. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, with syphilis dubbed the English disease. Treatment involved mercury, leading to madness, mouth sores, and death. Women bore the brunt, often blamed for moral decay, while men carried infection from bed to bed. Entertainment offered a brief escape from the daily grind. Music halls, theaters, and pubs provided laughter, song, and booze in equal measure. But even these havens had a dark side. Fire safety was non-existent, and crowded venues often ended in stampedes or collapse. Alcoholism was rampant, fueled by cheap gin and bitter ale. Drunkenness was a way of life, a means to forget the stench, the hunger, and the crushing weight of urban despair. Let's not forget the workhouses, institutions designed to help the poor by breaking their spirits. Families were separated, meals were sparse, and labor was brutal. Workhouses were feared more than the streets. Entering one meant surrendering dignity for survival. Orphans, the elderly, and the disabled were treated as burdens, and death was often a release. These places weren't homes. They were warehouses for the unwanted, where the only escape was a pine box. And yet, amid the grime and gloom, Victorian London was alive. Its people, hardened by hardship, found ways to laugh, love, and endure. Communities forged bonds over shared suffering, and the human spirit, battered but unbroken, persisted. The city itself pulsed with a grim vitality, a testament to resilience in the face of unrelenting adversity. Victorian London was unlivable, but for those who survived it, it was home. Let's climb the social ladder, where the stench of the streets meets the sweet perfume of privilege. In the upper echelons, the rich lived in opulence, their mansions adorned with chandeliers, velvet drapes, and servants for every whim. Yet, Even here, the rot seeped in. Plumbing was rudimentary, and chamber pots were still a thing. Behind the grandeur lurked misery, servants working 16-hour days, coal fires belching smoke into gilded rooms, and the constant threat of scandal. Respectability was everything, and reputation, once tarnished, was impossible to cleanse. Domestic service was the largest employer of women. Maids, cooks, and nannies labored in silence, invisible cogs in the machine of aristocratic life. They slept in cellars or attics, ate scraps, and endured relentless drudgery. Abuse was common, and escape was rare. Yet for many, it was better than the streets, where poverty stripped away even the illusion of safety. The class divide wasn't just a matter of wealth, it was a chasm of experience, a daily reminder of who mattered and who did not. Education, too, reflected this divide. The wealthy enjoyed private tutors and elite schools, while the poor relied on charity institutions, often overcrowded and underfunded. Literacy was a luxury, and child labor took precedence over learning. The Factory Acts of the mid-century attempted reform, but enforcement was spotty. Children as young as 5 worked 10-hour shifts, their growth stunted, their futures bleak. Knowledge was power, and in Victorian London, most had neither. Imagine waking up to the sound of hooves clattering on cobblestones, mingled with the cries of vendors, the wails of the dying, and the occasional gunshot. Welcome back to Victorian London, where the air is not fit for breathing, the water not fit for drinking, and the housing not fit for rats. But this was home for millions. Let's dive deeper into this maze of misery and marvel, where every corner tells a tale of survival, scandal, and sewage. Let's begin underground, not with the sewers, though they're certainly worth a revisit, but with the London Underground, the world's first subway system, opened in 1863. A marvel of engineering, yes, but also a hellish tube of smoke and noise. Powered by coal-burning steam engines, the tunnels filled with choking soot, turning commuters into living chimney sweeps. Trains were packed, ventilation was a cruel joke, and for some, the daily ride was like a journey through Dante's Inferno, minus the poetry. Still, it beat walking through streets that doubled as open cesspools. Speaking of transportation, let's not forget the horses. London ran on horsepower, quite literally. Over 300,000 horses trotted, galloped, and died on London streets, leaving behind mountains of manure, an estimated 1,000 tons per day. The smell was relentless, and the flies, biblical. Dead horses often lay where they fell, bloating in the sun, waiting to be carted off by the overworked knackers. Pedestrians navigated this minefield of filth with long skirts and longer curses, and slipping in dung was just part of one's morning commute. Let's peek into a Victorian kitchen, a place of culinary nightmares and domestic warfare. Cooking was done over coal fires, which meant soot in your food was just seasoning. Refrigeration was non-existent, so meat was often suspect, preserved with salt or left to fate. Kitchens were small, smoky, and teeming with vermin. Rats, cockroaches, and fleas were more reliable dinner guests than your neighbors. And let's not even begin on the utensils, often rusted, unwashed, and shared by entire households. Food poisoning? Just another Tuesday. Now, consider the water situation. The Thames, as mentioned, was a bubbling broth of human waste, dead animals, and industrial runoff. Public water pumps offered an alternative, albeit not much better. Cholera outbreaks were frequent and deadly, the result of contaminated water and zero understanding of germ theory. It wasn't until Dr. John Snow, not that one, mapped cholera cases in 1854 and traced them to a single water pump that people began to realize maybe drinking sewage wasn't ideal. Laundry was a Herculean task. Washing clothes meant hauling water, boiling it over a fire, and scrubbing garments with lye soap that could melt your skin. Drying clothes in London's perpetual damp was another challenge. Lines crisscrossed tiny rooms, draping everything in a curtain of moist fabric. Mildew thrived, colors faded, and wearing clean clothes was less about hygiene and more about surviving laundry day. And underwear? Rarely washed. Most people owned one set, maybe two, worn until they disintegrated. For those who ventured out, the streets offered not just filth but spectacle. Public executions were phased out by mid-century, but the bloodlust lingered. People flocked to see prisoners transported, fires extinguished, or buildings collapse. Street performers, often missing limbs, entertained with grotesque flair, while beggars offered every imaginable deformity for spare change. It was theater, tragedy, and survival all in one, and no one looked away. Let's now explore the fragrant world of Victorian medicine. Snake oil salesmen thrived, hawking cures for everything from baldness to syphilis. Patent medicines were laced with opium, mercury, or alcohol, sometimes all three. Laudanum, an opiate tincture, was the drug of choice, especially among the middle and upper classes. It dulled pain, soothed nerves, and slowly ruined lives. Self-medication was common, and seeing a doctor often meant facing more danger than the illness itself. Bloodletting persisted, as did purging, blistering, and other forms of sanctioned torture. Now, the fashion. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Women's dresses could catch fire from open hearths, their voluminous skirts acting like tinder. Crinolines, those hoop skirts, made sitting a hazard and walking a skill. Men weren't spared either. Tight collars could strangle, top hats caused headaches, and lead-based cosmetics poisoned slowly but surely. And shoes? Narrow, unpadded, and often worn until holes appeared. Foot rot and bunions were just the price of elegance. Romance in Victorian London was a complex affair, tangled in social rules, poverty, and disease. Marriage for love was rare among the working class. Survival was the goal. Brothels thrived, ranging from high-end establishments to squalid dens. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, with syphilis dubbed the English disease. Treatment involved mercury, leading to madness, mouth sores, and death. Women bore the brunt, often blamed for moral decay, while men carried infection from bed to bed. Entertainment offered a brief escape from the daily grind. Music halls, theaters, and pubs provided laughter, song, and booze in equal measure. But even these havens had a dark side. Fire safety was non-existent, and crowded venues often ended in stampedes or collapse. Alcoholism was rampant, fueled by cheap gin and bitter ale. Drunkenness was a way of life, a means to forget the stench, the hunger, and the crushing weight of urban despair. Let's not forget the workhouses, institutions designed to help the poor by breaking their spirits. Families were separated, meals were sparse, and labor was brutal. Workhouses were feared more than the streets. Entering one meant surrendering dignity for survival. Orphans, the elderly, and the disabled were treated as burdens, and death was often a release. These places weren't homes, they were warehouses for the unwanted, where the only escape was a pine box. And yet, amid the grime and gloom, Victorian London was alive. Its people, hardened by hardship, found ways to laugh, love, and endure. Communities forged bonds over shared suffering, and the human spirit, battered but unbroken, persisted. The city itself pulsed with a grim vitality, a testament to resilience in the face of unrelenting adversity. Victorian London was unlivable, but for those who survived it, it was home. Let's climb the social ladder, where the stench of the streets meets the sweet perfume of privilege. In the upper echelons, the rich lived in opulence, their mansions adorned with chandeliers, velvet drapes, and servants for every whim. Yet, even here, the rot seeped in. Plumbing was rudimentary, and chamber pots were still a thing. Behind the grandeur lurked misery, servants working 16-hour days, coal fires belching smoke into gilded rooms, and the constant threat of scandal. Respectability was everything, and reputation, once tarnished, was impossible to cleanse. Domestic service was the largest employer of women. Maids, cooks, and nannies labored in silence, invisible cogs in the machine of aristocratic life. They slept in cellars or attics, ate scraps, and endured relentless drudgery. Abuse was common, and escape was rare. Yet for many, it was better than the streets, where poverty stripped away even the illusion of safety. The class divide wasn't just a matter of wealth, it was a chasm of experience, a daily reminder of who mattered and who did not. Education, too, reflected this divide. The wealthy enjoyed private tutors and elite schools, while the poor relied on charity institutions, often overcrowded and underfunded. Literacy was a luxury, and child labor took precedence over learning. The Factory Acts of the mid-century attempted reform, but enforcement was spotty. Children as young as 5 worked 10-hour shifts, their growth stunted, their futures bleak. Knowledge was power, and in Victorian London, most had neither. Religion offered solace, control, and hypocrisy in equal measure. Churches provided charity but also preached obedience. Hellfire sermons kept the masses in line, while the wealthy bought absolution through donations. Religious fervor clashed with daily depravity, creating a moral maze that few could navigate unscathed. Sin was everywhere, but forgiveness? That was up for sale. Crime was rampant. Pickpockets, con men, and gangs ruled the night. The police force, born in 1829, struggled to keep order. Corruption was endemic, and justice often meant a swift trial and a swifter punishment. Prisons were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and violent. Yet, crime offered opportunity, a twisted ladder out of poverty for the desperate and daring. And through it all, the fog rolled in. That thick yellow smog, a mixture of coal smoke and damp air, blanketed the city, hiding its sins and suffocating its people. It was the physical manifestation of Victorian London, oppressive, omnipresent, and inescapable. Yet, in that haze, life continued. People loved, dreamed, and dared to hope. Victorian London was unlivable. It was dangerous, filthy, and cruel, but it was also vibrant, alive with the clamor of survival. Every brick, every alleyway, every soot-stained face told a story of struggle, of resilience, of the indomitable human spirit. This was home, and for better or worse, they lived it. Imagine the most powerful woman of the 16th century, commanding armies, slapping courtiers, and outwitting assassins, while rocking an immense rough collar and layers of powdered makeup. And now imagine she was not a woman at all. Welcome to the deliciously absurd world of Tudor conspiracy theories, where Queen Elizabeth of Ferbers, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the mother of the English Renaissance, may have been a man in a dress. Yes, brace yourself for one of history's most bizarre rabbit holes, where the line between fact, fantasy, and farce gets obliterated by the sheer lunacy of speculation. Let's begin with a small village called Bisley in Gloucestershire, a place forever scarred by a tale so ludicrous it has endured for centuries. According to legend, the young Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was sent to Bisley during a plague outbreak, and, as the story goes, she tragically died there at age 10. But what to do when your royal offspring is dead and your monarch father is, shall we say, a tad volatile? Why, you find a local peasant boy who resembles her, slap a dress on him, and pray no one notices. Yes, this is the Bisley boy theory, the ultimate Tudor cover-up, where a child's death is concealed by a last-minute gender swap that fools Europe for over 4 decades. The theory claims Elizabeth's governess and tutors, terrified of Henry VIII's wrath, replaced her with this impostor, who then grew up, assumed the throne, and led a nation while secretly hiding his true identity. According to believers, this explains why Elizabeth never married, never had children, and never allowed physicians to examine her too closely, because, obviously, she was a he. Let's pause to consider the logistics. A child, raised as a girl, suddenly becoming a queen, fooling every foreign ambassador, courtier, and suitor, maintaining the act through puberty, politics, and public scrutiny, managing to look utterly regal while also concealing a supposed beard, and all this in a court notorious for gossip, intrigue, and betrayal? Well, why not? After all, Tudor England was a soap opera with beheadings. Proponents of the theory point to Elizabeth's insistence on privacy, her temper, her fondness for male-coded language, and even her fashion. The iconic wigs, heavy makeup, and ornate dresses, perfect for hiding masculine features. Her high collars and padded bodices, obvious camouflage. Never mind that this was the style of the day, designed to convey power and wealth. No, clearly it was all part of a decades-long ruse to hide Adam's apple and stubble. Then there's the Virgin Queen title, which, in this context, takes on a whole new meaning. Elizabeth was famous for her refusal to marry, despite countless suitors and relentless pressure. Historians suggest this was a political move, a way to maintain independence in a male-dominated world. But to the conspiracy crowd, it's proof she couldn't marry because she wasn't biologically female. After all, no woman could possibly prefer ruling alone to being shackled to a European prince and popping out heirs, right? Let's talk medical evidence, or the lack thereof. Elizabeth fell ill multiple times, but there's no record of any doctor discovering or suspecting her alleged secret. Her ladies-in-waiting, her dressers, her maids, not one of them leaked this explosive truth. Not a single diary, letter, or whisper from the inner circle. Either they were complicit in the greatest hoax in royal history, or they were all somehow blind, deaf, and mute for 45 years. And what about portraits? The Tudors loved their paintings, propaganda in oil. Elizabeth was depicted countless times, and while her features were often idealized, none suggest she was male. Her famous pale face, narrow waist, and delicate hands. Apparently, 16th century artists were part of the cover-up too, or they painted what they saw, a powerful, enigmatic queen. Now, the deathbed mystery. Elizabeth died in 1603, and even in death she refused to be examined. Her body was shrouded and no autopsy was performed. Suspicious, or simply royal protocol? Modesty was paramount, and even in her final moments, Elizabeth clung to her image. Stoic, untouchable, sovereign. To conspiracy theorists, this is the smoking gun. To historians, it's tradition. But tradition doesn't sell books, documentaries, or late-night history specials. Let's not forget the psychological toll of this theory. If true, imagine the pressure of performing femininity for a lifetime, of living in constant fear of exposure, but also imagine the resilience, the brilliance, the sheer audacity it would take to pull it off. Either way, we're looking at an extraordinary individual. Queen or king, Elizabeth defied every expectation, ruled with unmatched skill, and left an indelible mark on history. And what of the motivations behind this theory? Misogyny, perhaps? A disbelief that a woman could wield such power, command such loyalty, and outmaneuver every enemy? Easier to believe she was a man in disguise than to accept a woman could be that formidable. It's the same old tune, played in every century, with new lyrics each time. Still, the theory persists. Bisley even celebrates it with festivals, locals dressing as Elizabeth, or the Bisley Boy, in a mix of reverence and ridicule. It's become folklore, a legend that refuses to die, feeding on our fascination with secrets, identity, and the unknowable past. In the end, Queen Elizabeth I remains a mystery, not because of her gender, but because of her genius. She ruled alone in a man's world, bending history to her will. Whether she was the Virgin Queen, the Bisley Boy, or something in between, she remains one of the most compelling figures in history. Enigmatic, powerful, and utterly unforgettable. The court of Elizabeth I was a stage, and she the greatest actor of her time. Not for mere theater, but survival. Whether she was hiding her political intentions or, according to some, her true gender, she played the role to perfection. But let's dive deeper into the conspiracy stew, this time examining the clues that proponents of the Bisley Boy theory cling to like gossip-starved courtiers. First, her wardrobe. Oh, the wardrobe. Elizabeth's clothing was not simply regal. It was armor, a fortress of silk, velvet, lace, and pearls. She wore as many as 40 layers at a time, including corsets tight enough to rearrange internal organs and collars so large they could block peripheral vision. To believers, this was not fashion, but camouflage. Every ruff, every glove, every jeweled bodice was allegedly designed to hide a masculine jawline, calloused hands, or, gasp, a lack of feminine curves. Even her towering wigs? More than style, they were allegedly strategic, perhaps concealing a more square, less dainty skull. The logic here is immaculate. If you dress like a Christmas tree for 4 decades, surely it's because you have something to hide. And her voice? Descriptions from the time note Elizabeth's commanding tone, her sharp tongue, her ability to project across a crowd. Some even said her voice was deep for a woman. Cue the theorists with their magnifying glasses. Was she projecting male authority, or did her voice betray something more? Of course, no one had microphones in the 1500s, and the line between powerful speech and masculine tones was as thin as Elizabeth's patience with fools. Then there are the love affairs that never quite happened. Elizabeth flirted endlessly, famously stringing along Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, for decades. Their relationship was scandalous in rumor, but curiously sterile in fact. Despite their proximity and affection, no scandalous letters, no confirmed trysts, no pregnancies. Elizabeth managed to maintain the aura of a romantic heroine without ever needing to consummate anything. Theorists argue this was not coyness, but necessity. The risk of exposure during intimacy was too great. which makes one wonder, did Elizabeth spend her reign not only dodging political assassination, but romantic entanglement with equal zeal? Robert Dudley himself becomes a figure of intrigue. Was he in on the secret? Was their closeness born of trust, shared secrets, or perhaps a calculated alliance? Some speculate Dudley helped protect Elizabeth's alleged secret, perhaps even orchestrated parts of the deception to secure his own power. It's the stuff of Tudor fan fiction, scandal, conspiracy, betrayal. But it doesn't stop there. Enter the foreign ambassadors, those eagle-eyed emissaries of rival courts. They sent home dispatches, often critical, sometimes adoring, occasionally confused. Several noted Elizabeth's remarkable intellect and presence, but none noted anything odd about her appearance or manner. These were men trained to observe, to report anomalies. That they saw nothing suspicious, proof to theorists that Elizabeth was the ultimate deceiver, or perhaps the ambassadors simply saw a woman of formidable power who defied their expectations. The plot thickens with the question of succession. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir caused constant tension. Her advisors begged, foreign powers schemed, and Parliament fretted. Yet Elizabeth remained immovable. Was it political brilliance, or was she buying time, avoiding exposure? Some claim her reluctance stemmed not from strategy, but fear, that in naming an heir she would draw attention to her own lack of legitimacy. If her reign was a house of cards, succession was the breeze that might topple it. Then there is the curious case of the Tower of London. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, one of her first acts was to imprison her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman with a competing claim to the English crown. Was it merely politics, or something more personal? Some theorists suggest Elizabeth feared Mary would discover the truth. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a silencing chamber. Mary's eventual execution, a final, brutal measure to protect the secret. And what of her childhood portraits? Elizabeth, as a girl, appears delicate, slight, unmistakably feminine. But the theorists argue that early portraits could have been altered, or that the child in those paintings was already the imposter boy. A switch so early, so seamless, that not even the portraitists knew. The more one scrutinizes these images, the more imagination is required to see a boy. But conspiracy thrives on doubt, not evidence. Now we turn to Elizabeth's education, a dazzling display of intellect. She spoke multiple languages, debated theology, and wrote poetry. For the time, her intellect was extraordinary. To some, it was suspicious. How could a woman be so brilliant, so well-read, so commanding? The answer, for theorists steeped in patriarchal nonsense, she couldn't have been. Clearly, she was a man. Because in their world, genius is gendered. Finally, consider the enduring mythos. The Virgin Queen was more than a ruler. She was an icon. Her image, tightly controlled, was projected across Europe as a divine, almost otherworldly figure. She was married to her people, to her realm, to the very idea of England. Some say this was a convenient fiction. Others see it as an elaborate screen, a myth to protect a lie. But even if she were an imposter, her myth outgrew the truth. She became legend, and legends are immune to biology. In all of this, the theory does not hinge on proof, but possibility. Could it have happened? Could a boy have become queen, fooled the world, and changed the course of history? The evidence is flimsy, the logic dubious, but the story endures because it captivates. We want to believe that beneath the rough and jewels there was a grand secret, because history is so much more fun when it's scandalous. Yet whether Elizabeth was woman, man, or something in between, one fact remains: she ruled. For 45 years she outlived rivals, defeated the Spanish Armada, and ushered in a golden age. No matter the theories, her legacy is cemented. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. In trying to strip her of her identity, the conspiracy only underscores her power. Because imposter or not, Elizabeth won, and the world remembers her name. But let us now dive headlong into the cavernous archives of absurdity, because no Elizabethan conspiracy is complete without a touch of theatrical espionage, Renaissance identity theft, and ecclesiastical meddling. Welcome to the third act of the great Tudor gender mystery, where history and hysteria dance an awkward jig, and no one knows who's leading. It begins, as all good conspiracies do, with a secret letter, or rather, the absence of one. No diaries, no personal correspondence, No gossip-laden journals exist where Elizabeth confesses to being anyone other than herself. To the conspiracy theorist, this is a red flag, a flashing neon sign reading erased, sanitized, hidden exclamation mark, because apparently the lack of evidence is not exoneration, but confirmation. What better proof of a secret than its total absence from the record? Now, consider the solemn court physicians, those learned men of science and superstition, who served Elizabeth for decades. They tended to her fevers, her melancholy, her maladies both real and imagined. Not one, according to official records, ever muttered a single word about gender anomalies. Did they swear oaths of silence, or were they blind to the truth hidden beneath layers of taffeta? One must believe they either conspired willingly or were fools in robes. Because surely a man masquerading as a queen would slip up during a medical exam, right? Unless, of course, Elizabeth invented the art of the royal telehealth visit. Enter John Dee, court magician, mathematician, and spy, an actual historical figure whose resume includes summoning angels and designing espionage codes. Dee was Elizabeth's advisor, a confidant who spoke to spirits on her behalf. Was he also the keeper of her secret identity? Some theorists believe Dee used his arcane arts not just to divine foreign plots, but to shield Elizabeth from exposure. Perhaps the angels he communed with were simply metaphors for smuggling gossip or manipulating the perception of the court. After all, if you can convince people you talk to angels, convincing them the queen is a woman might be child's play. Then there's the matter of Elizabeth's death mask, or rather, its peculiar absence. Monarchs of the era were often immortalized post-mortem with a death mask, a plaster cast capturing their final expression. But Elizabeth's has never been definitively found. Was it destroyed, lost, or as theorists posit, deliberately hidden to conceal her true visage? Imagine the death mask with a prominent Adam's apple or square jaw. The scandal, the horror, the hasty burial. Conveniently, her tomb offers no answers, only a regal effigy, serenely feminine, carved from cold stone and colder intentions. And what of her inner circle? The ladies-in-waiting, those ever-present noblewomen who dressed, bathed, and attended the queen? Surely, if there were a deception, these women would know. Unless, of course, they too were part of the grand masquerade. Theorists imagine a cabal of loyal attendants sworn to secrecy, paid handsomely, or perhaps terrified into compliance. Because nothing says functional monarchy like a constant game of royal dress-up under the threat of execution. Let us not forget the clergy. The Church of England, freshly severed from Rome, was navigating its own identity crisis. A female monarch was already controversial. An impostor would have been catastrophic. So naturally, the theory goes, church officials chose to maintain the illusion rather than risk civil war. Bishops, priests, and theologians turned a blind eye, preaching divine right while quietly managing divine deception. In this narrative, religion becomes the velvet glove over the iron fist of gender fraud. Meanwhile, in the bustling streets of London, common folk celebrated their queen with festivals, plays, and pageants. Elizabeth was adored, her image printed on coins, her name invoked in prayer. Did the people suspect? According to theorists, they were blissfully unaware, content with bread, ale, and the occasional beheading, because nothing distracts from royal secrets like a public execution or a rousing bear-baiting spectacle. And now, we approach the juiciest morsel in this feast of nonsense, the possibility that Shakespeare himself was in on it. The bard, whose pen danced across Elizabeth's reign, wrote complex gender-bending plays full of disguise and mistaken identity. Was this literary genius also a court insider, subtly mocking the queen with plays like Twelfth Night and As You Like It, where women become men and men become women? Did he know the truth, encoding it in sonnets and soliloquies? Or is this simply another case of historical pareidolia, seeing patterns where there are none, attributing secrets to art because the facts are too boring? The theory even extends to foreign rulers. Catherine de' Medici, Mary of Guise, Philip II of Spain, were they aware? Were diplomatic negotiations subtly influenced by whispered rumors and clandestine knowledge? Perhaps Elizabeth's formidable diplomacy was driven not just by statecraft, but by the constant need to protect her identity, her refusals to marry, her insistence on control, not stubbornness, but survival tactics. As we peel back the layers of this conspiracy onion, what we find is not a solid core of truth, but tears. Tears of laughter, tears of incredulity and perhaps a few tears of frustration, because the more one examines the Bisley Boy theory, the more it reveals about our own obsessions. We crave secrets, we distrust power, and we cannot resist the allure of a historical scandal, especially when it challenges the narrative of female competence and authority. In the end, the true question is not whether Elizabeth was a man, but why so many are desperate to believe she was. Is it a refusal to accept that a woman could rule so effectively, so independently, and so brilliantly? Is it misogyny wrapped in a Tudor ruff? Or is it simply our human tendency to turn the extraordinary into the impossible, to look at greatness and ask, what's the catch? Whatever the answer, one fact remains. Elizabeth I reigned. She shaped history. Whether she did so in petticoats or pantaloons is ultimately irrelevant. But oh, what fun it is to speculate. And in that speculation, we see the mirror of our own doubts, our own fascinations, and our own need to believe that behind every legend lies a scandalous truth. So now we reach the final curtain, the last act in our theatrical dissection of Tudor identity madness, where fact, fiction, and farce merge into a spectacular, historical fever dream. Let us begin our grand finale not with Elizabeth, but with those who came after her, historians, biographers, and armchair theorists, all desperately trying to unscramble the omelet of her reign without cracking the myth. The Victorian era, in particular, was a breeding ground for speculative Elizabethan revisionism. These were people who loved lace, adored propriety, and feared female agency unless it was bathed in tragic virtue. To them, Elizabeth I was either the Virgin Queen or a cautionary tale of female pride. Enter the Bisley Boy tale like a melodramatic plot twist, a Victorian Gothic fantasy where gender becomes the ultimate scandal, and history is a trembling maiden in distress. Publishers of the 19th century pounce on this theory with the glee of scandal-hungry tabloids. Pamphlets emerged, pseudonymous authors hinted at suppressed truths, and amateur sleuths traveled to Bisley, hoping to uncover the bones of the original Elizabeth. What they found instead were some very confused villagers in a centuries-old cottage that might, if one squints hard enough, resemble a Tudor hiding place. Proof? Hardly, but it was good enough for Victorian sensibilities. From there, the legend snowballed. Elizabeth was now not just a queen, but a question mark. Playwrights turned her into a tragic hero, novelists into a shadowy enigma, and amateur historians into a figure of ridicule or reverence, depending on the mood. Meanwhile, actual scholars buried their faces in their hands, wondering why their meticulous research was being overshadowed by what amounted to Tudor fan fiction. Then, of course, came the 20th century, with its penchant for Freudian analysis and postmodern skepticism. Suddenly, the Bisley Boy theory was back in vogue, this time rebranded as a symbol of repressed identity, gender fluidity, and social constructs. Elizabeth, it seemed, was not just a potential imposter, but a canvas for every cultural anxiety of the modern world. She became the Schrodinger's queen of history, both man and woman, both fraud and genius, depending on who was looking. TV specials emerged. Documentaries with ominous voiceovers promised to reveal the hidden truth behind the crown. They showed dramatic reenactments of a young boy being dressed in royal garments, sobbing ladies-in-waiting, and grim-faced advisors plotting to preserve the monarchy at all costs. Never mind that none of this was substantiated. It made excellent television, and that, as we know, is the true currency of modern history. Let us not forget the internet, the great equalizer of facts and fiction. Here, forums buzzed with wild claims. Blurry photos of Elizabethan portraits were analyzed with forensic intensity, and amateur genealogists claimed descent from the real Elizabeth, whoever that was. YouTube channels offered hour-long breakdowns, complete with ominous music and flashing red arrows pointing to suspicious features in 400-year-old paintings. Because if the Mona Lisa can hide secrets, why not the Darnley portrait? And then there's the merchandise. T-shirts proclaiming Elizabeth was a man, sold to the delight of conspiracy enthusiasts. Coffee mugs bearing the slogan, "Long live the Queen," or King. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that absurdity sells, and no one wants to drink their morning brew without a side of Tudor intrigue. But let's step back. Let's breathe. What does this all say about us? About our relationship to the past? The Bisley Boy theory, in its chaotic glory, reveals not a hidden truth about Elizabeth, but a very loud truth about the human mind. We are addicted to mystery. We distrust clarity. We find power uncomfortable unless it comes with scandal, especially when wielded by a woman who refused to marry, refused to obey, and refused to conform. Because at its heart, this theory is not about gender or identity, it's about control. Elizabeth I controlled her narrative, her court, her kingdom. That, more than anything, is what makes people uncomfortable centuries later. The idea that someone, especially a woman, could be that powerful, that self-assured, and leave so few personal traces behind, it demands an explanation. And if history can't provide a scandal, we are more than happy to invent one. In the end, Elizabeth remains an enigma, not because she was hiding something, but because she was, in many ways, unknowable. She played her cards close, crafted her image meticulously, and ensured her legacy was one of grandeur and mystery. Whether she wore a crown over a wig or corsets over chainmail matters little. What matters is that she endured, she ruled, she outlived them all. So next time you hear a wild historical theory, be it about Elizabeth, Napoleon, or the moon landing, remember this: sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. But sometimes fiction is just us trying to make sense of greatness with the only tools we have: doubt, humor, and a touch of paranoia. Long live the Queen, whoever she was.